A red rose snagged on the splinter by the loading door brushed Halina across his sleeve just as Bruno Pike shouted, "Stop right there! What do you think you're taking?" And that was the night a quiet bakery worker, carrying sacks of unsold bread out of the back door, was branded a thief in front of a crowd with phones in their hands. Stay with this, because the man who saw her humiliation from the shadows was the owner of the whole chain, and before the night was over, he would follow her into a part of his own past he had buried so deeply he no longer knew it was still alive. The bakery sat behind a row of dark shop windows, its front all warm light and pretty cakes, its back all metal, steam, wet concrete, and the sour, sweet smell of dough crust drying in bins. Closing time always had its own rhythm there. Trays clanged into sinks, the dishwasher hissed, someone cursed softly over a broken frosting bag. The last rack of sandwich loaves cooled near the service hall while the day staff counted till drawers and wiped flour from their aprons. Halina was part of that closing shift ritual so completely that people almost forgot to look at her. She was the woman at the counter who remembered children's names, wrapped day-old rolls for older customers who lived alone, and never raised her voice even when the lunch line curled to the door. She was small, plain in the way tired, good people often are, and careful with her hands. Every evening, after the last sale, she tied up 2 burlap sacks from the surplus table, the leftovers. Misshapen loaves, dry buns, seeded heels, crusts too hard for morning shelves, everything chain policy said had to be logged, bagged, and destroyed. Most nights, nobody stopped her. That was what made this one feel so ugly so fast. Bruno had been branch manager for less than 3 months, but he had already learned the kind of authority that feeds on witnesses. He liked standing where others had to look up at him. He liked saying policy, as if the word itself came with a badge. That evening, he had been in the back office checking shrink reports when he saw Halina cross the loading bay with the sacks balanced against her hips. He came through the metal door so hard it bounced off the stopper. "There she is," he snapped, loud enough to freeze the whole yard. "I knew it. I knew somebody was walking product out of here." 2 drivers turned. A cake decorator leaned into the doorway. A teenage porter, still wearing 1 blue glove, lifted his phone before his face had even settled into an expression. Halina stopped 3 steps from the alley gate. The cords of the sacks had dug deep red marks into her fingers. She did not turn right away. She just stood there, shoulders straight, head slightly bowed, as if she were giving herself 1 private second before the public shame arrived. Then she faced him. Bruno came closer, breathing hard through his nose, the way men do when they want anger to look like righteousness. "Open them," he said, "right here. If it's nothing, you've got nothing to hide." A couple of people laughed, though it had no joy in it. 1 woman lowered her eyes. Another kept filming. Halina's mouth tightened, but she did not plead. She did not explain. She crouched slowly, set both sacks on the damp ground, and loosened the knots with hands that had spent all day slicing bread and passing change. The yard had gone strange and still by then. Even the compressor hum from the freezer unit seemed farther away. Bruno folded his arms and waited for the little drama he thought he was directing. What none of them noticed at first was the black car easing into the far corner near the flour deliveries. Daniel Vale had arrived without warning, as he sometimes did when he wanted to inspect a branch without speeches and polished numbers. He was a wealthy man by any measure, the sort people described as private first and rich second, because money had stopped being the most interesting thing about his distance years ago. He had stepped out to ask about maintenance logs. Instead, he found himself standing beside a pallet of empty milk crates, watching one of his workers be humiliated over 2 sacks that smelled unmistakably like yesterday's bread. He could have walked forward then. He did not. Halina peeled the burlap back. Inside were stale loaves, nothing more. And Bruno, already red with the shame of being wrong in front of an audience, opened his mouth again. If this story pulls you in, a like or subscribe helps more people find it. Because the next thing he said would send Daniel after her into the dark. What came out of Bruno's mouth next was worse than the accusation, because now he knew the sacks held no stolen pastries, no hidden cash drawer stock, no secret orders meant for resale. He had been wrong in front of half the closing crew, and a man like Bruno could not bear to look small. So he straightened his shoulders, jabbed a finger toward the bread, and changed the crime. "I don't care if it's stale," he barked. "Chain policy says waste product gets destroyed on site. You walk it out that door, you're taking company property. Same difference." The words hit the yard with a different kind of chill. A few people who had almost relaxed stiffened again. It was easier for them if he was right. Easier if the whole thing could still be called procedure. Halina stayed where she was, one hand resting on the open sack as if the bread needed sheltering from the sound of him. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady. These were marked for disposal. Bruno snapped back so fast he nearly talked over her first breath. "Exactly. Disposal. Not charity, not favors, not your personal little mission." The teenage porter lowered his phone for a second, then raised it again when he realized Bruno was building himself a fresh audience. Someone near the sink muttered, "Come on, man," but not loud enough to count as courage. The smell of old crust and wet burlap had thickened in the yard. Halina retied one of the cords with careful fingers, buying herself a moment. "The night manager before you knew," she said. "I've taken the leftovers for a long time." Bruno gave a short laugh that had no humor in it. "Then he was wrong too." He leaned in just enough to make the circle tighten around them. "Listen carefully, because this is the last time I'm going to say it nicely. Tomorrow morning, you report to HR. Tonight, you leave those sacks here. If one loaf goes missing, you can explain it in writing." That was when Daniel, still near the stack of crates, saw something he would not forget. Halina's face did not crumple. She did not beg for her job. She did not try to win the crowd back. She looked at the bread first, then at the ground, then at Bruno, with a kind of tired hurt that belonged to somebody who had been carrying more than sacks for a very long time. "If I leave them here," she asked, "what happens?" Bruno threw out a hand toward the dumpster cage. "You know what happens. They're logged and destroyed." The cake decorator winced. Everybody in that yard knew what destroyed often meant. Slashed bags, bleach sprayed across bin tops, bread ruined on purpose so nobody poor could touch what a receipt had failed to claim. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. He had approved reports, systems, compliance language. He had signed off on loss prevention summaries with polished phrases and neat columns. He had never stood close enough to smell the waste. Bruno stooped, grabbed one of the sacks himself, and shoved it back toward the loading room. "Inside, now." Halina's hand stayed on the burlap one heartbeat longer before she let go. That tiny delay said more than a speech could have. She rose, smoothed her apron with both palms, and stepped aside as though the scene belonged to someone else now. The crowd began to loosen in awkward fragments. 2 workers drifted back to the dish pit. One driver muttered that he had a route to finish. The phones went down, though not all the way. Bruno, flushed and sweating, pointed at Halina again. "And wipe that look off your face. You're lucky I'm not calling the police." He wanted the last word. Men like him always do. But the moment had already slipped from his hands because another pair of eyes had seen the whole thing and judged it very differently. Daniel waited until Bruno disappeared inside with the sacks and the others scattered back into their tasks. Only then did he move. He did not go to Halina. He did not announce who he was. He simply watched her walk out of the yard empty-handed, her shoulders still straight, her pace measured, as if dignity were the one thing she refused to surrender on that concrete. She crossed the alley to the bus stop beneath a flickering pharmacy sign and stood alone under its pale light. After a minute, she took something from her apron pocket. A small paper ticket, folded and unfolded so many times the edges had gone soft. She looked at it once, pressed it flat with her thumb, and tucked it away again. When the bus pulled up, with a sigh of brakes and diesel, Daniel turned to his driver and said, very quietly, "Stay here." Then he loosened his tie, stepped into the night, and followed her aboard. The bus lurched away from the curb with a groan of tired brakes, and Halina moved straight to the back, keeping her head down the way people do when they know their face has become a story for strangers. Daniel boarded through the rear door just before it folded shut. He stayed standing at first, one hand on the cold metal pole, the taste of old coffee still on his tongue from the office he had meant to visit instead. The bus smelled of wet coats, rubber flooring, and that faint city mix of dust and engine heat that settles into fabric after dark. Halina sat by the window with her bag on her lap, empty now except for her apron, her locker key, and whatever small things belonged to a life that did not have room for waste. She stared out without really seeing the pawn shop lights, the discount pharmacy, the darkened laundromat windows sliding past. At the third stop, the crowd thinned. A grocery clerk with sore feet got off. A man in work boots slept through his station and woke swearing softly. Daniel finally took a seat 2 rows behind her, angled just enough to watch without being obvious. He told himself he only wanted to know whether Bruno had been right about some personal mission. But even in his own mind, that excuse already sounded thin. Halina reached into her coat pocket and touched that same folded paper ticket again, more like a habit than a check. Then she pulled out a pen and wrote something tiny on the back, with the bus shuddering under her hand. Account, Daniel guessed. Maybe loaves, maybe names. When the route left the bright commercial strip and moved into older blocks, the city changed with it. Storefront glass gave way to porches patched with plywood, chain-link fences, sagging gutters, a corner mural faded by seasons of rain. Halina rang the bell near the end of the line. She got off onto a street where the pavement had more cracks than paint left on it. Daniel waited half a breath, then followed. The night was quieter there. No delivery trucks, no restaurant music, just the rattle of an air conditioner somewhere high up, and the far bark of a dog behind a fence. Halina walked quickly, like someone late for people who were counting on her. She cut through a narrow side lane between a shut barber shop and a brick building with boarded basement windows. On one back step, a woman in slippers lifted 2 fingers in greeting. Halina nodded without stopping. At the next corner, a teenage boy in a hoodie held open a gate and said, "You made it." She answered with the first warmth Daniel had heard in her voice all evening. "Barely. They kept me late." Then she disappeared into a small yard tucked behind an old chapel annex with peeling cream paint and a roof patched in 3 different shades. Over the gate hung a weathered wooden sign with a sparrow painted in blue that had almost washed to gray. Sparrow House. Children's Shelter. Daniel stopped so suddenly his shoes scraped the gravel. For a second, he thought he had read it wrong. Then the side kitchen door swung open, and a stripe of yellow light fell across the yard. Children came running first, hungry in that organized way children in hard places learn to be. "Miss Halina's here," one called. Another reached for the bag she carried and found it too light.
No sacks tonight?
That question hit Daniel harder than Bruno's shouting had. Halina knelt to eye level with the boy, cupped the back of his neck, and said softly, "Not tonight, sweetheart. There was trouble at the bakery." A woman in her 60s came out behind the children, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Broad shoulders, silver hair pinned in a hurry, flower on one cuff. "Trouble how?" she asked. The kitchen behind her smelled of onion, broth, and toasted crust. Halina's answer came low, meant for adult ears. "New manager stopped me, made a scene, opened everything in the yard." The older woman closed her eyes for one brief second, the kind that tells you this was not the first hard thing she had absorbed for others. "Come inside," she said. "We'll talk while I stretch the soup." Stretch the soup. Daniel had not heard that phrase in years, yet the sound of it moved through him like a hand reaching into a locked drawer. He knew that doorway. He knew those chipped green steps. He knew, before he admitted it, the exact angle of the hallway beyond, where wet mittens used to hang above a radiator in winter. A little girl with one sock sliding down looked up at Halina and asked, "Are we still having toast pieces?" Halina managed to smile for her. "We'll find something." The woman at the door touched Halina's arm. "Miriam kept the potato bread from lunch, and there's yesterday's pan loaf." Then, as the children tugged Halina inside, Daniel saw a bulletin board in the entry hall covered with drawings, notices, and old photographs curling at the corners. One of those photographs showed a group of boys in paper crowns at a long folding table, and one of them was him. Daniel did not move for several seconds after he saw that photograph. The night seemed to narrow around the gate, around the yellow square of kitchen light, around the sound of children's shoes tapping over old linoleum inside. He knew the picture before he truly recognized his own face in it. Paper crowns made from grocery bags, a dented punch bowl on the table, a birthday cake too small for all the children there, cut into careful slivers by hands that knew how to make little feel like enough. He had not thought about that room in years. Or maybe he had thought about it too often and called it something else so he would not have to feel what came with it. From where he stood, he could hear drawers opening, spoons clinking, the low hum of a refrigerator that sounded older than some of the children running through the hall. Then Halina's voice drifted back through the doorway. "I'll slice the potato bread thin. If we toast it twice, it'll hold the soup." That sentence, plain as it was, struck him harder than the photograph. She had come here empty-handed after being branded a thief, and the first thing she did was start solving dinner. He edged closer to the gate and looked through the mesh. Sparrow House was smaller than the memory he carried, and also more crowded. The yard had a leaning swing set with one chain wrapped in tape. The back steps had been patched with two kinds of wood. A row of rubber boots, some too big and some too small, sat beneath a bench by the door. Inside the kitchen, he could see Miriam setting out bowls that did not match. Halina was already at the counter, sleeves rolled, working fast with a bread knife that had lost most of its handle coating. One boy dried plates with a towel over his shoulder, like a little restaurant worker. A girl with braids counted spoons under her breath. There was only the practiced adjustment of people used to having less than they needed. Miriam opened a pot and stirred. Steam rose, carrying the smell of onion, pepper, and stock stretched one ladle too far. "How much did they toss tonight?" she asked without looking up. Halina shook her head. "I don't know. Bruno sent it back inside." Miriam let out a breath through her nose. "Then we do what we always do. We make supper from what stays." The words pulled loose something old in him. Make supper from what stays. He had heard that kind of sentence here as a boy, when the world felt temporary and every kindness arrived with a dent in it. He remembered waiting by those same counters in socks that never stayed dry. He remembered the smell of dish soap and cinnamon crust. He remembered a woman with flour on her cheek lifting burnt raisins from the top of bread pudding and handing them to the children who liked the sweet parts best. In his mind, her name came slowly, through years of boardrooms and polished silence. Etta. Mrs. Etta Shaw. She had worked somewhere with ovens back then, or maybe volunteered. Or maybe, in a place like this, the difference had never mattered. Daniel pressed a hand against the cold iron of the gate and felt his throat tighten. He had built a company that talked about freshness, standards, brand protection, shrink control. Here, within walking distance of one of his own stores, a woman from his counter staff had been feeding children for years with the bread his policy condemned to garbage. A little boy appeared in the hall again, the same one who had asked about toast pieces, and tugged at Halina's apron. "Miss Halina, are you in trouble?" he whispered, trying to whisper and failing in the way children do. Halina paused just long enough to brush crumbs from his shirt. "I'm all right tonight." "But are you coming tomorrow?" he asked. That question stilled the room more than Miriam's earlier concern had. Even the girl counting spoons looked up. Halina smiled for the children. but the smile sat on top of strain. "I'll do my best." Miriam turned then, really turned, and studied her face under the kitchen light. What did he say exactly? Halina laid the knife down. "That I took company property, that I report to HR in the morning, and that if one loaf goes missing, he'll put it in writing." Miriam's expression changed at the last part. Recognition. The kind older women get when they have seen shame dressed up as authority before. She wiped her hands and crossed to a narrow cabinet by the office door. From the top shelf, she took a binder swollen with papers, receipts, and folded notes. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "it's time somebody else put something in writing too." Daniel straightened outside the gate, because on the front of that binder, in faded blue marker, he could just make out the words bread log, donations, and one name underneath that made his heart stop again. Etta Shaw. Daniel stayed outside the gate, half hidden by the dark post, while Miriam opened that old binder on the kitchen table. The plastic cover crackled. Papers shifted. A smell of broth, toasted crust, and damp wool drifted out every time the door swung wider for a child running through. Halina stepped closer, wiping her hands on her apron before touching the pages, as though even a worn ledger deserved respect. "You kept all of it?" she asked. Miriam gave her a look that was almost gentle and almost sharp. "I keep what people in offices pretend never happened." Inside the binder were loose receipts, clip notes, and ruled pages written in different inks by different hands. Some entries were neat, some hurried, some smudged with what looked like grease or rain. Daniel could not read every line from where he stood, but he caught enough. Rye heels, 6 pounds. Dinner rolls, 14. Split sandwich loaves, enough for breakfast toast. Beside many of the entries was the same short note, delivered after close. Then another name appeared again and again from years earlier, Etta Shaw. Underneath that, in newer handwriting, Halina Cross. The sight of those two names on the same pages made something settle in him and twist at the same time. This was a routine, a quiet bridge built loaf by loaf between his bakery and this place, and it had been standing for years while he signed reports about waste control. Miriam turned several more pages and stopped at one folded slip taped into the margin. "Here," she said. "This is from the old night manager, the one before Bruno." Halina leaned in. "Tom?" "Tom," Miriam said. "He never wanted credit, so I never gave him any. Just dates." She read aloud in a low voice, for herself as much as for Halina. "Permission to collect surplus at close, so long as items are logged as unsellable and moved off-site the same night. Better eaten than ruined." Miriam let the paper fall back against the page. "He wrote that after the third winter we almost ran out of breakfast." Halina swallowed. "I remember." Daniel felt heat rise in his face, though the night air had cooled. Somewhere down the hall, a child laughed. A spoon clattered to the floor. Life in the shelter kept moving while the words on those pages accused more than Bruno ever could. Miriam closed the binder halfway and looked at Halina over the top of it. "Tomorrow, if they try to bury you in paper, you don't go in empty-handed." Halina shook her head at once. "No. If I drag Sparrow House into this, they'll say I was using store product for some outside arrangement. They'll shut every door they can find." "They may do that anyway," Miriam replied. "People who shame somebody in public don't usually stop there." Halina lowered her eyes. For the first time that night, she looked tired enough to bend. "If I lose the job, I lose the room upstairs from Mrs. Vale's laundromat by the end of the month. She keeps it cheap because I'm steady. If I'm not steady..." She did not finish. She did not need to. Miriam understood. So did Daniel. A job like Halina's was never just a paycheck. It was rent, bus fare, soap, shoes that lasted one more season, a little space in the world where a person could shut a door and breathe. Then Miriam said something that made him go still again. "Etta warned me this would happen someday." Halina looked up sharply. "Warned you? Miriam nodded and turned to the back pocket of the binder. From there, she drew a small envelope, yellowed at the corners, with a bakery logo Daniel had not seen since the earliest years of the company. She said once the chain got bigger, compassion would have to sneak in through side doors. Too many polished people would start calling waste policy wisdom. Halina stared at the envelope. What is that? Miriam held it a moment before answering. A letter Etta asked me to keep. She said if the bakery ever forgot what bread is for, this might matter. Daniel felt the world tilt in a very quiet way. Because on the front of that envelope, beneath Etta Shaw's careful handwriting, was a name no one at Sparrow House should have known mattered anymore. Daniel Vale. For one strange second, Daniel almost stepped forward and said his own name. He did not. He stayed where he was, one hand still on the gate, while inside the kitchen, Miriam turned the envelope over in her fingers, as if it had weight beyond paper. Halina did not reach for it right away. She looked at the front, then at Miriam, then back again. "You never told me there was a name on it," she said. Miriam gave a tired little shrug. "Because it was never the right time. Etta said if that name ever mattered again, we'd know." In the hallway, bowls were being set down one by one. The sound was soft, almost musical. A child called for more pepper crackers. Somebody laughed because the youngest boy had asked whether toasted crust counted as chips if you closed your eyes. Life kept going in Sparrow House the way it always had, with small hunger and small kindness sharing the same table. Miriam slid a thumb beneath the flap, but did not open it yet. "Supper first," she said. No child waits because adults found an old secret. Halina nodded and moved back to the counter, but Daniel could see that her thoughts had not stayed with the bread knife. She sliced too slowly on the first loaf and had to correct the angle. Miriam noticed, took the knife gently from her hand, and handed her the soup ladle instead. "You portion, I'll cut." The exchange was so ordinary it hurt to watch. These women had built a whole language of help that used almost no words at all. Daniel remembered that language. He remembered being 6 years old and pretending not to cry over a split lip from schoolyard trouble because one of the women here had set a cup of warm milk in front of him and asked whether he wanted cinnamon in it. That had been the mercy. No questions that made a boy smaller, just cinnamon if he wanted it. The children lined up with bowls and mismatched cups. Halina served each one by memory, not by guess. Less broth for the boy who spilled when the bowl got too full. An extra toasted edge for the girl with the braids. The soft centerpieces saved for the smallest two. Daniel watched her move through them and understood something he had been too insulated to see before. It was order, predictability, a person arriving when she said she would, with something warm enough to hold in both hands. That was why the humiliation at the loading door had felt so ugly. Bruno had not only shamed a worker, he had kicked at a quiet structure other people were standing on. When the last child sat down, Miriam finally carried the envelope into the little office beside the kitchen. It was hardly an office at all. A metal desk, a humming lamp, a filing cabinet with one drawer that never fully shut, and a corkboard with appointment cards pinned over older appointment cards. Halina followed her inside. Daniel shifted to the side window where the blind had been bent upward at one corner. He could see enough without exposing himself. Miriam set the envelope on the desk and opened a drawer. From it, she took a pair of reading glasses repaired with tape at one hinge. "Etta wrote this near the end," she said quietly. "Her hands were bad by then. I remember because I had to steady the paper while she signed." Halina touched the envelope again, very lightly. "Near the end of what?" Miriam looked at her over the glasses. "Near the end of her baking. Near the end of her standing all day. Near the end of pretending she didn't know what was coming to places like this once people with clean shoes started running everything by policy." There was no bitterness in the way she said it, only the flat knowledge of someone who had watched need get translated into paperwork too many times. She unfolded the letter. The paper crackled so loudly in that tiny room, Daniel felt it in his chest. Miriam's eyes moved over the first lines, and then her whole expression changed. Not dramatic. It was smaller than that, and somehow more serious. She sat down. Halina leaned closer. "What is it?" Miriam did not answer at once. She read another line, then pressed her lips together and looked toward the kitchen door, where the children's voices rose and fell like a tide. Finally, she said, "Etta wasn't writing to us. Not exactly." Halina frowned. "Then who?" Miriam lifted the page, and now, even from the window, Daniel could see one sentence written larger than the rest, because Etta's hand must have shaken on it.
If Daniel Vale ever returns, tell him the bakery forgot before the children did.
Daniel stepped back from the window as if the words themselves had touched him. Inside, Halina whispered, "Daniel Vale, as in Daniel Vale Bakers?" Miriam nodded once, the same. Halina looked stunned for a moment, then wary in the next. Why would Etta know him? Miriam drew a slow breath and turned the paper over, as though checking whether she had the right sheet. "Because before he owned the ovens," she said, "he ate from them here." And just then, behind Daniel in the yard, a floorboard on the back step gave a sharp creak. The creak came from so close behind him that Daniel turned at once. A boy of maybe 12 stood on the back step in socks and a zip-up sweatshirt too big in the sleeves. He had one hand on the rail and the other wrapped around a chipped mug that smelled faintly of weak cocoa. He did not look frightened. He looked observant, the way children in crowded houses often do when they have learned that adults tell half the truth with words and the other half with where they stand. "You've been here a while," he said quietly. Daniel opened his mouth, then shut it again. There was no clean answer ready. The boy tipped his head toward the office window. "If you're hiding, you're not doing a very good job." Inside, Halina and Miriam were still talking too low for him to catch now. The kitchen sounds had softened into that after-supper rhythm of spoons scraping bowls and chairs nudging back from the table. Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. The boy glanced toward the gate, then back at him. "That's what people always think right before they do." There was no meanness in it, only experience. He took a cautious sip from the mug, then added, "Miss Halina doesn't bring strangers." The sentence landed where it was meant to. Daniel looked past him through the dim hall. On one wall hung construction paper birds, some with names written in crooked marker. On another were coat hooks at child height, most of them full. This place was still doing what it had done when he was small, holding more people than it had room for. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eli," the boy said. "And yours?" Daniel hesitated a fraction too long. Eli noticed. Children like that always notice. "Right," the boy said. "So either you're lying or you're somebody who thinks his name matters." Before Daniel could answer, Miriam opened the office door. Warm light spilled into the hall. She saw Eli first, then Daniel just behind him, and her whole body went still. Not in fear, in recognition of a moment arriving before anyone had prepared for it. Halina turned at the pause in the conversation and followed Miriam's gaze. For one heartbeat, the three of them simply looked at one another. Daniel standing in the yard with his coat still on, Halina with the envelope in her hand, Miriam with Etta's letter unfolded against her palm. Eli shifted on the step and muttered, almost to himself, "Oh, so you do have a name." Miriam was the first to speak. "If you've come this far, you may as well stop listening through windows." Her voice was even, but it had weight in it. Daniel stepped up onto the porch. The boards gave under his shoes with the same old complaint he remembered from childhood. That small sound alone nearly undid him. Halina did not move aside at first. Her face held confusion, exhaustion, and something else now, the first thin thread of understanding. She looked from him to the envelope and back again. "You're Daniel Vale," she said. It was not a question. He nodded once. The name sounded different spoken there, in that narrow hall with soup still in the air and children whispering from the dining room. Smaller, less armored. Miriam folded the letter carefully before answering the shock in Halina's eyes. "He used to sleep in the back room at the end of this hall," she said. "Before my time, but not before Etta's." Halina's fingers tightened around the paper. "You were here?" Daniel swallowed. For a while. It felt like an insult to call those years a while, but he did not yet trust his own voice with more. Eli, still on the step, looked between them with open curiosity. "You're the bakery man?" he asked. Daniel turned toward him. "Yes." The boy frowned. "The real one or one of the fake important ones?" Halina almost laughed despite herself, the sound brief and tired. Daniel felt the corner of his mouth move for the first time that night. "The real one, I'm afraid." Eli considered that, then lifted his mug again. "Then you should probably come inside before Mrs.
Miriam decides for you.
Miriam gave him a look that said he had spoken out of turn, and she was not altogether sorry that he had. They went into the office because there was nowhere else private enough. The room felt smaller with Daniel in it, as if his tailored coat and polished shoes did not belong near the dented cabinet and the stack of coloring sheets waiting to be filed. Halina stood by the desk instead of sitting. Daniel remained near the door. Miriam kept the letter in her hand. Nobody rushed. The shelter had taught all of them, in different ways, that hard truths land better when given space to settle. At last, Halina asked the only question that mattered to her first. "Did you know?" Daniel looked at her. "About the bread, about me taking it." He answered plainly. "I knew tonight. I followed you here after Bruno stopped you." Her face changed. Not anger exactly, more like a deeper tiredness, because now she had one more powerful person to reckon with. "And you watched?" she said. Daniel did not defend himself. "Yes." That honesty made the room quieter than any excuse could have. Miriam set the letter down on the desk between them. "Then before anyone says another word," she said, "I think you should hear what Etta left for you." She slid the page across the scratched metal surface toward him. And when Daniel reached for it, he saw that there was something folded inside the letter itself. A photograph he had never seen before. Daniel slid the photograph free with more care than he had used on most contracts in the last 10 years. It was small, black and white, edges curled, one corner cracked. 3 women stood outside a bakery side door beside 2 dented milk crates and a stack of cooling racks. He recognized Etta at once from memory and from the way Miriam had described her hands. Beside her stood a younger Miriam, straighter-backed, dark-haired, holding a ledger against her apron. And between them, wrapped in an oversized coat with the sleeves folded back twice, was a thin boy gripping a loaf with both arms as if someone might take it from him. Daniel did not need anyone to tell him who that child was. He knew the ears, the narrow chin, the guarded stare that always looked older than it should have been. On the back, in blue ink faded almost to smoke, were 6 words. "First winter, Daniel carried bread himself." Halina watched his face more than the photograph. "You remember it," she said softly. He gave a slow nod, but memory was not arriving in neat order. It was coming the way cold does through a cracked window, all at once and in places he had forgotten were exposed. The metal smell of a service hallway, snow tracked over old tile, Etta tearing loaves by hand because the knife had gone dull, someone laughing when he tried to hide 2 extra rolls in his coat pocket for later. He had not carried bread often, only when the older boys were sick or the weather was too bad or Etta's joints were swollen. But he had done it. He had walked from a back door to this building with warm loaves against his chest, and somewhere between that child and the man he became, he had allowed that memory to be covered over by policy, profit, and the hard language of people who no longer touched what they discussed. Miriam sat very still while he turned the photo over again. "Read the letter," she said. Daniel unfolded the page. Etta's handwriting leaned heavily to the right, as if each line had cost her effort. He read the first line in silence, then the next. Halina and Miriam waited. Even Eli, who had drifted to the doorway pretending not to listen, held himself quiet. Finally, Daniel spoke, but only because the words seemed too large to keep inside his own head. If this reaches you, then somebody at the bakery has started confusing order with goodness. His voice roughened on the last word. He cleared his throat and kept reading. Etta wrote that bread had always traveled two ways. One way through the front, paid for under bright glass. The other through the back, where shame, hunger, and dignity met in the dark and had to be handled by people with a conscience. She wrote that any business dealing in food would one day face a choice: guard appearance or feed human beings. Then came a line that made Halina lower her eyes and Miriam close one hand over the desk edge. If a quiet worker carries what you taught your managers to destroy, do not ask first whether she broke policy. Ask what policy broke in you. No one in that room rushed to fill the silence after that. From the dining room came the faint scrape of children stacking bowls. Someone was humming off-key. The old radiator in the hall knocked twice. Daniel placed the letter down, as if it had become heavier in his hands. "I didn't know," he said, and hated how small the sentence sounded. Miriam answered him without cruelty. "No, you chose not to know in the way successful people often do. That's different." Halina stayed near the desk, one hand resting on the envelope. "The bread shouldn't have had to sneak," she said. "Not all these years." Daniel looked at her then, really looked, at the flour dust still caught in the seam of her cuff, at the tired red marks the sack cords had left across her fingers earlier, at the way she held herself even now, after being branded a thief in front of strangers, as though she had no time to waste on self-pity because morning was coming and children would still need breakfast. "How long?" he asked. Halina understood what he meant. "With me? 6 years. Miriam added, "With the bakery? Longer." Daniel shut his eyes for a brief moment. 6 years. Hundreds of evenings, maybe more. All while reports crossed his desk describing loss, shrink, disposal, compliance. Eli finally stepped inside the office. "So are you going to help her?" he asked, direct as ever. Children can sometimes put a knife through layers of adult language without even trying. Daniel opened his eyes. "Yes," he said. It was the truest thing he had said all night. Halina's expression did not soften. "Tomorrow?" she asked. "Because by tomorrow morning, Bruno will already have his version ready." Miriam gave a tight nod. "And men like that arrive early when they smell advantage." Daniel reached for the letter again, this time with purpose. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I go back before he starts." Then he looked at Halina. "But first, I need every document you have. The bread log, that note from Tom, anything with dates." Miriam was already turning toward the binder. Halina took one step to help her. And just then, Daniel's phone, silent until now, lit up in his coat pocket with a message from his assistant. Urgent. Regional HR has received an incident report already filed tonight. Employee termination requested before opening. The message changed the air in that little office at once. Daniel looked down at the bright screen in his hand, then locked it without answering. For a second, he seemed older than he had in the loading yard. Older even than the man in the photograph. Halina saw enough in his face to understand the direction of it. "He filed it already," she said. It was not a guess. Daniel nodded once. Termination request before opening. Eli made a soft sound in the doorway, half disgust, half disbelief. Miriam did not move quickly, but her eyes sharpened. "Then he's afraid," she said. "Only frightened people rush paper through at night." The office lamp hummed above them. From the kitchen came the smell of dish soap and the last warmth from the soup pot. Somewhere farther down the hall, 2 children were arguing in whispers over whose turn it was to dry cups. Halina took the news the way she had taken everything else that evening, straight through the middle without performance. She lowered herself into the chair by the desk, folded her hands once, and stared at the binder as if measuring what it could and could not save. "If they cut me before opening, I won't even be able to get to my locker," she said. "My extra shoes are there. My bus pass refill card, too. It was such a practical grief that Daniel felt it more sharply than tears would have hit him. She was not thinking about pride. She was thinking about how a person's life gets stored in corners at work when home is small and money is exact. Miriam opened the binder again and began pulling out what mattered. "Then we don't waste time on outrage," she said. "We gather." She stacked the bread logs, Tom's note, and 3 carbon copy slips clipped with rusty metal fasteners. "These are from storm weeks, delivery counts, nights when the bread made breakfast here." Eli stepped inside fully now, mug forgotten on the filing cabinet. "I can get the pantry board," he offered, "the one Miss Halina updates." Halina looked up. "No, leave that where it is." "Why?" he asked. "Because if we pull apart the house for evidence," Miriam answered for her, "the children feel it first." Daniel reached for his phone again, this time to act. He called Claire Rowan, his assistant, and when she answered, he did not soften his tone. "I need the full incident file the moment it lands. The full file. I also want store disposal logs for the last 6 months, camera retention status for the loading yard, and the overnight scanner records." Claire was silent just long enough to tell him she understood the seriousness before she spoke. "I've already seen a flagged memo from Regional," she said. "There's also video online." Halina lifted her head at that. Daniel caught the movement and turned slightly away, but she had heard enough. Claire continued. "A clipped version. It's spreading fast." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Pull the original if you can identify it, and wake legal." "Tonight?" she asked. "Tonight," he said, and ended the call. No one spoke for a moment after that. The internet had done what crowds do now. It had taken a person's worst public minute and turned it into something portable. Halina sat very still, but her fingers pressed into each other so hard the knuckles paled. Miriam crossed the room and laid one hand on her shoulder. "Do you want the truth?" she asked quietly. Halina nodded. "Yes." Miriam said it plain. "By morning, strangers will think they know you." Halina gave one short breath that was almost a laugh and had no happiness in it.
They already did in the yard.
Daniel looked at her and felt shame move through him in a fresher form. His silence had not stayed small. It had multiplied. He had let Bruno define her in public, and the world had carried that definition outward before he had even left the neighborhood. Eli broke the heaviness in the only way a boy like him could. "Then beat him to mourning," he said. Miriam glanced at him, but she did not dismiss it. Daniel didn't either. The child was right. Whatever happened next could not begin at 9 o'clock with coffee and formal greetings. It had to begin before Bruno settled into his desk and before HR turned a lie into procedure. Daniel looked at the documents on the desk, then at Halina. "You shouldn't walk in there alone," he said. She met his eyes at last. "I wasn't planning to ask you for rescue." "I know," he replied. "That's part of why I'm here." The answer landed between them with an awkward honesty that neither of them trusted yet, but neither rejected. Miriam gathered the papers into a grocery envelope and wrote 3 words across the front in thick black marker. Sparrow House Records. Then she opened another drawer and took out a small key on a faded ribbon. "If the online video gets worse overnight," she said to Halina, "you don't go to your room by yourself. Sleep here." Halina shook her head immediately. "I have clean clothes there. And a staircase anyone can wait on," Miriam answered. That gave Halina pause. Daniel understood then that this was not only about employment anymore. Public shame has a way of making ordinary paths feel unsafe. "I'll have a car here before dawn," he said. "No logos, no driver questions." Halina almost objected, then stopped. Practical help was harder to refuse than pity. The office door opened a little wider, and one of the younger girls peeked in, hair damp from a rushed wash, clutching a toothbrush in her fist. "Miss Halina?" she asked. "Will you still be here when I wake up?" Halina's face changed at once. All the strain stayed, but something warmer moved over it. "Yes," she said. "I'll be here in the morning." The child accepted that completely and patted away. Daniel looked down at the envelope Miriam had prepared. On top of the records lay Etta's letter. And tucked beneath it now, newly slid there by Miriam's careful hand, was another item Daniel had not noticed before. A photocopy of a corporate memo bearing his own signature under the waste destruction policy. Daniel stared at the photocopied memo for a long second before he picked it up. His own signature was there at the bottom in confident black ink, the kind of signature that had closed warehouses, opened new branches, and made people in conference rooms nod as if permanence were the same thing as wisdom. The subject line read, "Disposal Integrity and Brand Protection." The language above it was worse than he expected because it sounded so clean. Unsold bread must be rendered unusable before removal. No off-site redistribution without executive approval. Liability exposure. Reputation risk. Inventory discipline. A whole paragraph of polished words whose real meaning was sitting right in front of him now. Hungry children, a shamed worker, and years of food ruined because no one in power wanted the poor to touch what had failed to sell. He let the page lower slowly. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Miriam answered at once. Etta saved it when the first copies went around. She said any rule that had to hide behind tidy language was likely doing something ugly. Halina reached for the memo, and Daniel handed it to her. She read more quickly than he had, lips tightening line by line. "This is why Tom started writing side notes," she said. "I never knew where that fear came from. I just knew he always looked over his shoulder on heavy nights." Miriam nodded. Because once that paper showed up, the bread had to move like a secret. Eli, who had edged closer again, pointed to one paragraph with a blunt fingernail. "What does rendered unusable mean?" Nobody rushed to answer. Daniel finally did. "It means damaged on purpose so no one can eat it." The boy frowned hard. "That's stupid." There are times in a story like this when a child says the exact thing every adult has spent years overcomplicating. This was one of them. The shelter quieted by degrees as bedtime settled over it. Pipes clicked. A faucet ran in the washroom at the end of the hall. Someone in the dormitory giggled and was shushed. In the office, though, nobody was anywhere near sleep. Claire called back with more than Daniel had asked for. The clipped video was already spreading on local pages. In it, Bruno's accusation was left full, and Halina's sack opening was cut short enough to make the bread look suspicious at a glance. A caption someone else had added read, "Bakery worker caught walking out with store goods." Claire also confirmed that the regional HR inbox had time-stamped Bruno's request and attached a draft recommendation for immediate suspension pending full review. "He moved fast," she said, "and he CC'd 2 operations managers." Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. "Of course he did." Claire hesitated, then added one more thing. "There's a staff comment on the internal thread from a prep worker named Theo. He says the edited clip is misleading and he has the full recording from the yard." That was the first clean piece of air anyone had gotten in a while. Halina closed her eyes briefly at the name. "Theo works bench prep," she said. "Quiet kid, good with timing." Daniel looked up. "Would he answer you tonight?" She shook her head. "He might answer Janice. She closes register and knows everyone's nerves better than I do." Miriam had already found a scrap pad and pen. "Then we called Janice." Halina hesitated before taking the pen. "If I pull coworkers into this, Bruno will turn on them too." Miriam's answer came firm. He already has if he's made fear part of the closing shift. Daniel heard the truth in that. Cruelty in a workplace rarely stops with the first target. It teaches everyone else how silence keeps them safe. Until it doesn't. Halina finally dialed. She put the call on speaker only after Janice answered with a whispery, "Please tell me you're home." When Halina said she was at Sparrow House, Janice exhaled so loudly the phone crackled. "Good. Don't go back to your room tonight if anybody can help it. People online are saying awful things." Halina's face stayed composed, but her fingers tightened around the phone. I need to ask you something. Did Theo keep the full video? Yes, Janice said at once. He was upset they clipped it. Bruno told him to delete it. He didn't. Daniel and Miriam exchanged a glance. Janice kept going, talking faster now that she knew someone was finally doing more than whispering in break rooms. And there's something else. Bruno made a big show of the bread after you left. Told Carl from Waste to dump bleach over the sacks before anyone could tamper with evidence. Carl hated it. He said so. Also, she stopped. Also what? Halina asked. Janice lowered her voice further. He made me print witness statements before I clocked out. They were already half written, like he knew exactly what everyone was supposed to remember. That changed the shape of tomorrow. Daniel straightened. Pre-written witness statements were not anger anymore. That was strategy. Not theft strategy, not hidden embezzlement, none of that. A small man's strategy for saving face by forcing others into his version of events. Janice, Daniel said, and she went silent at the unfamiliar male voice. This is Daniel Vale. There was a beat on the line so long he thought the call had dropped. Then Janice whispered, The owner? Yes, he said. I need you to do two things. First, tell Theo not to delete anything. Second, do not sign a statement tonight, no matter who asks. Janice took in a shaky breath. Mr. Vale, am I in trouble? No, he answered.
Not if I can help it.
After the call ended, Halina placed the phone on the desk very carefully, like something fragile had just passed through it. The room felt different now. Still strained, still tired, but no longer blind. There were logs, the letter, the memo, Tom's note, Theo's full video, Janice's warning, and the fact that Bruno had tried to poison the bread itself once the public scene did not go his way. Daniel tucked the photocopied policy under his arm and looked toward the dark hall where children were finally settling into sleep. I want copies made of everything before dawn, he said. Miriam nodded. There's a copy shop kiosk at the 24-hour pharmacy 3 blocks over. Eli spoke from the doorway before anyone else could. I know the clerk. He lets us warm our hands in winter. Miriam gave him a look. You are not going out at this hour. The boy lifted both palms in surrender, but Daniel was already reaching for his coat. Because his phone had lit again. This time, the message was from Bruno himself, and it contained a photo of Halina's locker with a red paper notice taped across it. Daniel turned the phone so Halina and Miriam could see the photo. It showed a narrow row of employee lockers under fluorescent light. Halina's was the third from the end, the pale blue one with a strip of old tape near the handle where the paint had chipped years ago. Across it, Bruno had taped a red notice in heavy black letters. Access suspended pending investigation. Under the photo was his message, smug in a way only a man can be when he thinks paperwork has made him untouchable. Procedure has begun. Best not to interfere. Miriam read it once and let out a breath through her nose that carried more contempt than surprise. Halina didn't speak at all for a moment. She just looked at the screen, then at her own hands, as if measuring what was left to her now. My room key is on the ring in my apron pocket, she said quietly. But my sweater is in that locker, the blue one, and the envelope from my landlord. It was such a small inventory of loss, and that made it cut deeper. Daniel slid the phone back into his pocket and made his decision before anyone could ask him to. I'm going now, he said. Not to the bakery floor, to the records room, the yard camera hub, and whatever office Bruno thinks belongs to him tonight. Halina lifted her eyes. He knows you've seen the message. If you walk in angry, he'll turn it into a power struggle. Daniel looked at her, and for once did not answer like an owner. It already is one. The difference is he thinks I'm not in it yet. Miriam was moving as he spoke. She packed the envelope of documents into a canvas grocery bag with 2 broken stitches near the handle. Then she pulled a small flashlight from the drawer and handed it over. "The side corridor behind the freezer still loses light after midnight," she said. Daniel almost smiled at the plain usefulness of that. Sparrow House did not offer grand speeches. It offered flashlights. Before he left, Halina stopped him with a question that mattered more than the locker. "If you get in there before him, what are you looking for first?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Original footage, the disposal scan, the incident draft, and proof the bread in those sacks was marked for destruction before you touched it." She nodded slowly. "Then check the gray terminal in the dock office, not the front desk one. The dock one shows the item code history in full." He blinked at her. "You know that?" "I've worked the close for years," she said. "People think counterstaff don't learn systems. We do, we just aren't asked." That landed with him too. Of course she knew. Of course the woman carrying the whole moral weight of the place knew the process better than the man waving policy at her. The car Claire sent arrived without logos, just as promised. A dark sedan with a driver who said nothing beyond "Mr. Vale" and "I'll wait." Daniel left Sparrow House with the canvas bag beside him on the seat and Etta's letter in his inside pocket. As they drove back through the sleeping streets, the city looked stripped down. Laundromat windows gone dark. A 24-hour pharmacy glowing in a pool of white light. A bus shelter with one man asleep on the bench under an ad for celebration cakes. Bread in the morning, bread at weddings, bread in lunchboxes, bread in the hands of children at a shelter. And somewhere between all those uses, his company had found a way to make it an instrument of humiliation. He looked again at the photocopied memo under the streetlights flashing through the window. There was no way around it now. Bruno had enforced the rule with cruelty, yes. But Daniel had authored the conditions that let cruelty feel official. At the bakery, the front entrance was dark, but the service side still held light in 2 windows. Bruno, it seemed, was not done for the night either. Daniel told the driver to stay put and came in through the delivery entrance with his own master key. Inside, the building smelled different after hours. Less like cinnamon and sugar, more like bleach, stale heat, cardboard trays, and metal cooling racks. The hum of refrigerators carried through the halls. Somewhere deep in the back, a printer clicked. Daniel moved quietly past prep tables dusted with flour and past the sink where sheet pans leaned to dry. On the wall near the employee lockers, the red notice on Halina's door looked even meaner in person than it had on a phone screen. He did not tear it down. Not yet. First, he went to the dock office. The gray terminal was still awake, its screensaver drifting over the monitor like blue smoke. He touched the mouse, entered his credentials, and pulled up the disposal log. Date, batch, product, status. There they were. 2 burlap sacks logged at closing under unsellable return stock. Status, destroy on site. Stopped before Bruno stopped her. Daniel felt a cold steadiness settle into him. One fact, clean, usable. He printed the page, then another. Then the scan history tied to Halina's shift code showing she had not altered a single inventory designation. The printer's whir sounded too loud in the quiet building. That was when he heard footsteps in the corridor. Not hurried, confident. Familiar with keys, with after-hours doors, with the belief that no one else had any right to be there. And a second later, Bruno's voice came from just outside the office door. "I knew somebody was still in here." Daniel did not hide the printouts, and he did not close the terminal. He turned as Bruno stepped into the dock office, one hand still on the doorframe, a ring of keys hanging from 2 fingers. For a split second, Bruno's face went blank. Then the color drained from it so fast it was almost visible under the humming fluorescent light. The office was small enough that there was nowhere for either man to pretend. The old printer was still warm. Sheets with disposal codes sat in the tray. The gray monitor glowed over Daniel's shoulder. Bruno recovered the way men like him always try to recover, by widening their stance and reaching for offense before shame can settle in. "Mr. Vale," he said too quickly, "I didn't know you were still on site." Daniel looked at him, then at the keys, then back to his face. "That," he said quietly, "is becoming a pattern tonight." The silence that followed was worse for Bruno than anger would have been. He stepped into the room and shut the door behind him with deliberate care, as if he could still make this private by force of habit. The place smelled of toner, stale coffee, and the faint sourness of cooling bread drifting in from the prep corridor. "I was just finalizing a personnel incident," Bruno said. "I meant to brief you first thing." Daniel glanced at the red notice photo still open in his phone messages. "By sending me a picture of her locker?" Bruno's mouth tightened. "I thought you'd appreciate decisiveness." Daniel almost laughed at that, but there was no humor in him. "You humiliated a counterworker in the yard, let staff film it, had food ruined after it was logged for disposal, pushed an overnight termination, and you call that decisiveness?" Bruno shifted. "With respect, sir, you're seeing one emotional side of a compliance issue." Daniel picked up one of the fresh printouts and held it between two fingers. "No, I'm seeing timestamps." Bruno's eyes dropped to the paper despite himself. There it was in black and white. The sacks had been marked unsellable and designated for destruction before Halina touched them. The status history was intact. No inventory diversion, no altered code, no theft. He tried one more pivot. "Even if that's true, removal is still unauthorized. Policy is very clear." Daniel set the sheet down on the desk and reached into the canvas bag. He drew out the photocopied memo with his own signature and laid it flat between them. Bruno seemed relieved for half a heartbeat, thinking he had found firm ground again. "Exactly," he said. "That's the policy I enforced." Daniel's voice stayed low, but it changed. "And that is the policy I am now reading with the consequences standing in front of me." Bruno blinked. That was not the answer he expected. He had counted on the usual thing: a wealthy owner defending system before person, procedure before conscience, the whole hierarchy of distance. Daniel watched the calculation fail in him and went on. "Do you know where she was taking the bread?" Bruno gave a dismissive shrug too quick to be sincere. "Some outside arrangement, I assume." "A children's shelter," Daniel said. "One that has been feeding kids with what this branch throws away for years." Bruno tried to harden. "That doesn't change the rule." Daniel stepped closer. "It changes everything." Bruno swallowed, and now his voice came out thinner. "Sir, with respect, if we make exceptions because employees feel strongly, we lose control. People watch. Boundaries collapse. Inventory discipline." Daniel cut him off with a small lift of his hand. "Stop saying discipline when what you mean is waste. Stop saying control when what you mean is fear." He did not raise his voice, but the words struck harder because he didn't. "You wrote witness statements before speaking to all the witnesses. You had bleach poured over bread after the scene in the yard. You taped off her locker before review. You sent me that photo because you thought I would admire how efficiently you buried her." Bruno opened his mouth, shut it, then tried again from a smaller place. "I was protecting the store." Daniel shook his head once. "You were protecting your pride." The old freezer compressor thudded on somewhere down the hall. Neither man moved for a second after that. Then Bruno did something careless. He glanced toward the filing tray on the side desk, just a flick of the eyes, but Daniel saw it. He crossed the room in 2 steps and pulled the tray open. Inside were 3 witness statements printed on company forms: Janice Taylor, Carl Benton, Theo Mercer. Each one was already half filled. Same wording in the first paragraphs, same phrase repeated almost line for line. Employee removed store goods without authorization and behaved evasively when confronted. Daniel turned one toward the light. The signature lines were blank. The timestamps at the footer showed they had been generated before midnight, before staff had even gone home. Bruno's face lost the last of its balance. "Those are drafts," he said. "Templates, to help people remember the format." Daniel looked up from the pages with an expression so controlled it was almost frightening. "No," he said. "To help them remember your version." He stacked the forms with the disposal printouts and slipped them into the canvas bag beside Etta's letter. Bruno took an involuntary step forward, then stopped himself. "You can't remove internal documents without notifying regional." Daniel turned toward the door. "Watch me." But he did not leave yet. His gaze moved past Bruno to the wall clock, then to the service hall beyond the glass pane. "There's one more thing I'm looking for tonight," he said. Bruno tried to gather himself. "What?" Daniel's eyes went to the small red light over the monitor bank in the corner office across the corridor, the one tied to archived yard footage. "The original camera feed," he said. And just then, from somewhere inside the building, a shredder started up. The sound of the shredder came again, longer this time, a dry mechanical chew from somewhere beyond the service corridor. Daniel was already moving before Bruno found his next excuse. He stepped past him into the hall, the canvas bag against his side, the dock office printout still warm in his hand. Bruno followed at once. "Mister." "Vale, there's no reason to go charging around the building in the middle of the night," he said, trying to sound managerial, trying to sound as if he still occupied the higher ground. Daniel did not slow down. The corridor behind the freezer was exactly as Miriam had said, one strip light dead, another buzzing weakly, leaving islands of shadow between the prep room and the administrative alcove. The air back there felt colder and smelled of cardboard, yeast, and disinfectant. A rack of unsliced sandwich loaves sat forgotten under netting, cooling in the dark. The shredder noise stopped just as Daniel reached the small records room at the end of the corridor. The door was half open. Inside stood Carl Batten from waist, shoulders hunched, one hand still resting on the shredder switch. Carl was a broad, tired man in his 50s with flour caught in the seams of his boots and a face that never hid what it felt quickly enough. When he saw Daniel in the doorway, his expression changed from duty to dread. On the desk beside him sat a stack of papers, some intact, some already reduced to white strips in the bin. Daniel looked once at Carl, once at the machine, then at the first surviving page on top of the pile. Witness statement. Employee observed carrying goods. Same phrasing, same template. Bruno stopped short behind him. "Carl," he snapped, too late. "What are you doing?" Carl turned slowly. "What you told me," he said, and the room got even quieter. Bruno shifted his tone at once. "I told you to destroy duplicate drafts, not official materials." Carl stared at him with the flat, exhausted disbelief of a man who has worked too many years to pretend he doesn't understand a lie when it changes clothes in front of him. "You handed me the stack and said, 'Run these through before morning.' Those were your words." Daniel bent and lifted the top sheet. Below it were two more, then a printed email thread with Bruno's notes in the margin, then an internal form authorizing temporary locker suspension. In the shredder bin lay torn strips of what looked like a draft discipline summary. Carl's jaw worked once before he added, quieter now, "I shouldn't have done it. I know that." Daniel looked at him, and whatever Carl expected to see there, it wasn't cruelty. "Did anything else go through?" Daniel asked. Carl shook his head quickly. "Just the top few drafts before you came in. I stopped when I heard voices." Bruno took a step forward. "This is getting absurd. We are talking about paperwork cleanup, not sabotage." Daniel straightened and faced him. "You're standing in a room with a shredder running after midnight, following a public accusation you pushed through with pre-written witness statements." His voice did not rise, but Carl lowered his eyes as if even he could feel the force of it. "Choose a better word if you want. The facts are not changing." Bruno spread his hands. "Then look at the facts in order. She removed product. You've got emotional community stories now, yes, but from a store control standpoint?" Daniel cut him off with a glance so sharp Bruno fell silent.
You still think this can be reduced to store control language. That is the sickness. Carl swallowed and pointed toward the far cabinet. There's more in there, he said. He had me print the camera retention form, too. Bruno's head snapped toward him. Enough! Daniel opened the cabinet himself.
Inside were plastic archive cases, a label maker, old inspection folders, and on top of a stack of invoices, a form requesting manual preservation of security footage from the loading yard. The request had been started but not submitted. The reason field read, Employee Theft Investigation. Time-stamped less than an hour earlier. Daniel held it up. You were going to preserve footage under a false category before anyone else could classify the event. Bruno's answer came fast, desperate now beneath the practiced tone. Because theft was the concern at the time. No, Daniel said. By then, the sacks had already been opened. That detail hit. Carl, still by the shredder, spoke again, almost against his own instinct for self-protection. There's another thing. Bruno turned on him. Don't! Carl ignored him. He told me to bleach the bread because if people came asking questions later, it should be clear nothing edible left the building. Daniel closed his eyes for one brief second. There it was. The same cruelty, again and again, dressed up as procedure, each step uglier because it had been chosen after the facts were already obvious. Bruno took a breath to protest, but this time even he sounded unsure of his own script. That was a health precaution. Carl let out a bitter little laugh. At midnight, after it was already headed for the bin? Nobody answered him, because nobody could. Daniel gathered the surviving papers, set the unsent footage preservation form inside the canvas bag, and turned toward the monitor room across the hall. We're done arguing about what happened, he said. Now we secure what still exists. Bruno moved to block the doorway. Not physically, just enough to make a statement out of standing there. Mr. Vale, if you access raw security without compliance present, you compromise chain of custody. Daniel stopped close enough that Bruno had to either hold his ground or step back. Then you may want to watch very carefully, he said, because I'm about to establish it. Bruno stepped aside. The monitor room was cramped and overheated from old equipment. 4 screens showed frozen corners of the bakery in grainy nighttime color. Front register, prep bench, service hall, loading yard. A 5th screen was dark. Daniel sat at the console and entered his credentials. Access denied. He tried again more carefully. Access denied. Bruno's silence behind him changed shape. It was no longer defensive. It was waiting. Daniel looked at the login field, then at the small handwritten label taped beneath the keyboard. Local archive password updated, 11:23 p.m. And next to it, in Bruno's neat block letters, was a new password Daniel had never approved. Daniel read the handwritten password once, then turned his head just enough to look at Bruno without fully taking his eyes off the console. The monitor room was hot, stale, cramped with old electronics and dust. A small desk fan turned in a tired circle and did almost nothing. One ceiling tile had yellowed at the corner from some old leak. All of it felt like the sort of neglected place where small corruptions liked to hide. Bruno shifted behind him and tried for calm again. We had a software patch earlier, he said. I updated the local credentials so unauthorized staff couldn't tamper with the archive. Daniel's hand rested lightly on the keyboard. Unauthorized staff, he repeated. You mean the woman you already decided was guilty before the files were even reviewed? Bruno folded his arms. I mean anyone without clearance. Daniel looked back at the note. The ink was fresh. The tape holding it down had not yet gathered dust around the edges. Then why is the password written on the desk like a grocery reminder? Bruno did not answer that. He did not have one. Carl was still in the doorway of the records room across the hall, watching with the rigid stillness of a man who has accidentally stepped into the truth and now knows stepping back will not save him.
Daniel entered the override credentials he used for branch-level emergencies. This time the system accepted them, but a warning box popped up on the screen. Recent local administrator changes detected. Export logs recommended. That made Claire's voice in his memory sharpen all over again. Move fast, pull originals, assume nothing sits safely where it was supposed to sit an hour earlier. Daniel opened the audit trail. There it was. Local archive password reset at 11:23 p.m. by branch administrator Bruno Pike. The loading yard camera retention setting had also been changed from automatic cloud sync to local-only temporary hold. Daniel felt something hard settle in his chest. That switch mattered. Local only meant footage could be touched before morning if the right hands stayed in the building. Bruno saw the screen and tried to get in front of it with his voice. That setting was for speed, he said. Cloud sync lags on nights with heavy network traffic. Daniel clicked deeper. Then why was the retention category marked internal personnel event rather than security incident? Bruno's silence answered first. Then came the smaller lie. Clerical shorthand. Daniel did not even give that dignity enough to argue with. He opened the video list. Yard camera, service door angle, loading bay wide shot, bench sink corridor. The files were there, but one of them, the wide shot from the exact time Bruno stopped Halina, showed a warning icon beside it. Partial overwrite pending. Daniel's pulse jumped once, sharp and cold. When does pending become deleted? He asked, still looking at the screen. Bruno hesitated too long. Carl answered from the hall. At the hour mark if nobody exports it. Daniel checked the corner clock on the monitor. 12:58. The confrontation had happened a little after midnight. They had minutes, maybe less. He moved quickly then, no more talking. He selected the file, hit export, and waited while the old machine ground into motion. The progress bar crawled like something half dead. 3%. 5. 7. The fan turned. The freezer compressors kicked on somewhere deeper in the building. Bruno stepped closer. Mr. Vale, if you create an unmanaged copy outside chain protocol, Daniel cut him off without looking up. Stop saying protocol as if it's a prayer. The bar kept creeping. 12%. 15. Daniel pulled out his phone and called Claire. She answered on the first ring. I'm in the monitor room, he said. Local password changed, sync disabled, one key file nearly overwritten. Start a remote preservation request now. He gave her the branch ID and the exact camera name. Claire was already typing. He could hear keys snapping under her fingers. Give me 30 seconds, she said. If the local unit hasn't fully severed uplink, I can freeze the retention state from Central. Daniel listened to the hum of the machine and watched the progress crawl to 23. Bruno finally lost some of his polish. You're making this bigger than it is. Daniel turned then, just once, and there was enough controlled fury in his face to make Bruno step back a half pace. You made it bigger when you called a woman a thief in front of a crowd and then tried to edit the proof around your mistake. Carl looked down at the floor. Even he seemed ashamed to be breathing the same air as the moment. The export reached 31%, 34. Then the screen flickered. For an awful second, the progress bar froze. Daniel's hand tightened on the edge of the desk. Claire came back in his ear. I've got partial central handshake, but the branch is blocking the mirror with local admin priority. I need one more thing. There should be a hardware token plugged into the back USB port. Find it and remove it. Daniel crouched at once. Beneath the desk, among dust and cables, was a small black drive blinking green. He pulled it free. The screen jumped. The frozen bar moved again, faster now. 42, 50. 63. Daniel let out the breath he had been holding. Claire spoke over the line. Good. Mirror restored. I'm capturing server side now. Bruno's face had gone pale in a more permanent way. He knew what that meant. Whatever survived the next minute would no longer belong to his branch alone. Daniel straightened with the little black token in his hand. You set this up so the footage lived or died where only you could reach it. Bruno tried once more to sound managerial. I set it up so a messy staff incident didn't spiral. Daniel slipped the token into his coat pocket. It already has. The export reached 89%, then 94, 96. And just before completion, the screen opened a preview frame from the recovered yard footage. In it, clear as glass, was Bruno himself leaning over the open sacks and seeing nothing in them but bread. For a moment, nobody in that overheated little room spoke. The preview frame sat on the monitor like a verdict waiting to be read aloud. Bruno bent over the opened burlap, his own hand braced on the bench beside it, his face turned fully toward the stale loaves and split rolls. No hidden goods, no missing till packets, no bakery stock diverted for profit. Just bread that had already been marked for destruction. Daniel let the image hold on the screen long enough for it to do its work. Behind him, Bruno tried to breathe as if nothing had shifted, but even the sound of that breath had changed. It had lost its certainty. Carl, still standing near the door, looked from the screen to Bruno and then down at the floor, as if he wanted no part in witnessing what was already obvious. The export completed with a soft chime. Daniel saved the file to an external drive, then waited for Claire's remote capture confirmation. When it came through in his ear, short and calm, "Server copy secured," he felt the first true piece of ground under his feet all night. Bruno reached for the last defense left to him. "That frame proves nothing by itself," he said. "Anyone can see bread and still suspect a pattern. Theft isn't always about one night." Daniel turned in his chair and looked at him with something colder than anger. "Then let's not use one frame." He reopened the full yard clip. On screen, the scene played from the beginning. Halina walking toward the gate with the sacks at her side, Bruno stopping her, workers drifting into a circle, phones rising, the public accusation, the forced opening, his own face visible now from the edge of the shot, though no one in the yard had noticed him then. Then came the crucial sequence. Bruno looked into the sacks, saw the bread, straightened, and kept speaking anyway. No sign of uncertainty, no pause to correct himself, no attempt to lower the temperature once facts appeared. He pivoted in real time from thief to policy violator, because pride needed a second script when the first one failed. Carl watched that part with his mouth set hard. "You knew right there," he said, not to Daniel but to Bruno. Bruno snapped back too quickly. "Watch your tone." Carl didn't. "No, you knew." There was a lifetime of swallowed workplace caution in the way he said it, but there was also a limit, and it had finally been reached. Daniel paused the footage and slid the external drive into his coat pocket beside the hardware token. Then he printed stills, Bruno pointing, the open sacks, the visible bread, the timestamp in the upper corner. The old printer spat them out one by one, mechanical, undeniable, ugly in their clarity. Bruno stepped closer to the desk. "Mr. Vale, I'm asking you to think carefully before you blow a disciplinary issue into some sentimental public mess." Daniel took the top still and held it up between them. "This public mess began when you chose humiliation over decency." Bruno shook his head. "I protected company standards." "No," Daniel said. "You protected yourself from looking foolish." That line landed harder than any shouted accusation could have. Bruno's jaw moved. His eyes flicked once toward the hall, then toward the monitor, then toward the exit, as if he were measuring which version of the story still had the best chance of surviving morning. Daniel saw it and understood something else at the same time. Men like Bruno do not only depend on policy, they depend on tempo. They count on people being tired, scattered, embarrassed, afraid of escalation. They count on the night doing half their work for them. Daniel stood. "Claire is freezing the branch file set from Central," he said. "Legal will have these copies before sunrise." Bruno tried one last turn. "And what do you tell them? That an employee admitted to taking product off-site for years?" Daniel reached for Etta's letter inside his coat and felt the crisp fold of it under his fingertips.
I'd tell them a branch manager used company rules to shame a woman for feeding children with bread we were already destroying. Carl exhaled through his nose, almost like a man hearing a sentence he had wanted someone above him to say for a very long time. Then Daniel remembered something Janice had said over the phone. Theo still had the crowd angle recording. That mattered. The archive clip was strong, but the phone video would show the human side of the scene from inside the half circle, where the laughter, hesitation, and Bruno's changing tone had played to witnesses. He called Claire again and asked her to get Theo's number from staff records and message him directly under executive authority not to delete anything. Claire answered that she already had. "There's another issue," she said. "Regional Operations wants to know why you're accessing branch systems at this hour." Daniel almost smiled at the absurdity of it. "Tell them because I own the systems." Claire lowered her voice. "One more thing. Bruno's incident packet auto-forwarded to 3 stores in the district. Staff chatter has started. By dawn, half the morning crews will have heard that Halina Cross is under theft review." That changed the stakes again. It was about stopping a lie from hardening into workplace folklore across the whole chain. Daniel looked toward the corridor where the first pale tint of almost morning had not yet appeared, but time could already be felt in the building. The dough for the breakfast round would be proofing soon. Drivers would arrive. Registers would wake. The day would begin whether justice was ready for it or not. He turned back to Bruno. "You will not contact another employee tonight," he said. "You will not send one more message, print one more form, or touch one more file." Bruno laughed once, but the sound was thin. "On whose authority?" Daniel stepped close enough that Bruno had no room left to pretend he didn't understand. "Mine." And just then, from the front of the bakery, the main alarm chirped. Someone with an opening code had just unlocked the building. The alarm chirp echoed through the front of the bakery, thin and sharp, then died into the low hum of the proofers and coolers. Daniel checked the time on the monitor. Too early for most of the morning crew, early enough for someone summoned. Bruno heard it too and recovered a little color, the way men do when they think reinforcements may have arrived in the form of routine. "That'll be opening," he said, trying to sound steady again. "You can't turn this branch into a tribunal before staff even clock in." Daniel did not answer him. He shut down the export screen properly, slipped the printed stills and audit trail into the canvas bag, and stood up from the console. Carl stepped aside in the hall without being asked. The 3 men moved toward the front in a silence broken only by the soft thud of their shoes on the service floor mats and the distant rattle of a metal rack being wheeled from one corner to another. The bakery looked strange in that hour before dawn. Display lights were still dimmed. The cake case reflected only pale shapes. A mixer bowl had been left upside down to dry near the sink. The smell of yeast was stronger now, warmer, alive, as if the building itself were preparing for morning, while the people inside were still tangled in the night. At the front counter stood Janice, still in yesterday's sweater under her work apron, clutching her phone in one hand and a set of till keys in the other. Beside her was Theo from bench prep, narrow-shouldered, flower on one cuff, his face tense in the way of someone who has spent the whole night deciding whether fear or conscience will run his day. Near the door, half in and half out of his jacket, stood the elderly guard who had opened the place early, Mr. Larkin, gray-haired, careful, the kind of man who apologized when the wind blew too hard. All 3 looked at Daniel first, then at Bruno, then at one another. Janice spoke before anyone else could. "Mr. Vale, I came because Claire called and said not to let anybody near the back office alone." Her voice shook, but only at the edges. Theo lifted his phone without ceremony. "I brought the full video." Bruno's head snapped toward him. "You were told to delete that." Theo swallowed. "Yes." Nothing more. He did not need more. Mr. Larkin cleared his throat softly. "And I, sir, I opened because I was instructed that the owner needed the branch accessible before opening." Daniel gave him the smallest nod of thanks.
That old man looked visibly relieved just to have been spoken to with respect. Bruno stepped forward, trying to pull rank over momentum. This is exactly what I meant. Panic, staff confusion, uncontrolled evidence handling. We need proper HR present before this goes any further. Daniel turned to Janice. Did you sign anything last night? She shook her head immediately. No, sir. Theo? No. Daniel glanced at Mr. Larkin. Did anyone ask you to witness or deliver paperwork? The guard nodded reluctantly. Manager Pike asked me to note that Miss Cross was denied access if she returned before shift. Bruno opened his mouth, but Daniel was already moving past him toward the small cafe table by the front window. Good, he said. Then we use the next few minutes well. He spread the papers across the table in orderly rows. Disposal logs, audit trail, camera password change, pre-written witness statements, the photocopied policy memo. Then, beside them, he set the still frame showing the open sacks and the bread in plain sight.
Janice pressed a hand over her mouth when she saw it enlarged on paper. Theo stepped closer, eyes fixed. Mr. Larkin removed his cap and held it in both hands. Bruno remained standing, but something in his posture had loosened. Just the first visible signs of a man losing control of the room he believed belonged to him. Theo, Daniel said, show me your recording. Theo unlocked his phone with hands that were trying not to shake. The video began from farther back than the yard camera had, from within the half circle of workers. The quality was rougher, the light harsher, but it captured things the fixed camera missed. The muttering in the crowd, Bruno's voice climbing when the sacks proved harmless, the narcissist laughter from two drivers, Janice saying under her breath, "They're just old loaves." And most important of all, the exact beat where Halina asked what would happen if she left them there, and Bruno answered plainly, "They'll be destroyed." Daniel paused it there. He looked at Janice. "Is that your voice?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." He looked at Theo. "Did you edit this?" "No." "Did anyone else have the original?" Theo hesitated. "I sent a short version to one friend in our district chat before I realized people were clipping it. That's where the bad caption probably started." Shame washed over his face as he admitted it. Daniel did not waste time punishing honesty. "Send the original to Claire now. Full file, no compression." Theo did it on the spot. Janice, who had been staring at the papers, suddenly pointed to one of the pre-written witness forms. "That timestamp," she said. "He printed these before Carl even came to mop the yard. I remember because I was balancing register 3 when the printer jammed." Daniel followed her finger. She was right. The time on the form matched a window before the bread had been ruined, before most staff had left, before any actual statement could have been taken. Bruno tried once more. Templates are common practice. This time, Janice turned to him directly. "No, they aren't. Not like that." It was a small sentence, but it marked a crossing, one worker breaking the habit of lowering her eyes. Then the front bell over the entrance gave a little metallic jingle. Everyone turned. Halina had arrived for her shift, wearing the same coat as last night, her hair retied, her face pale from too little sleep. And she stopped cold when she saw the red notice still taped across her locker in the hall behind them. Halina stopped just inside the doorway, one hand still on the handle, the morning chill following her in for a second before the bakery swallowed it. She had come prepared for trouble. That was plain in the way she held herself. Coat buttoned high, hair pinned tighter than usual, canvas lunch bag over one shoulder. But even then, seeing that red notice across her locker hit her in a place no amount of preparation could fully cover. Her eyes found it first, then the table with the papers, then Daniel, then Janice and Theo, and finally Bruno. The whole room seemed to hold one breath with her. The display lights were still low, throwing a pale yellow glow over the front counter glass. Somewhere in back, a timer clicked and a proofer fan started up. The day wanted to begin as if nothing had happened. The people in the room knew better. Halina did not ask a dramatic question. She asked the smallest one. "Am I allowed to get my things?"
Bruno opened his mouth immediately, eager for the firmness of rule language. But Daniel answered first. Yes. The single word landed cleanly. Bruno's face tightened. Mr. Vale, that locker is under review. Daniel turned his head just enough to make clear the interruption had not improved anything. Then consider this the review. Halina did not move toward the locker yet. She set her lunch bag down on the counter and looked at the papers spread across the cafe table. Her own humiliation was there in frozen images now. Open sacks, timestamps, Bruno pointing, bread visible in black and white. It is one thing to live through a public scene. It is another to see it flattened into documents. Her throat worked once before she spoke. You found the footage. Theo stepped forward a little, phone still in hand. And the full crowd video, he said. Janice added, almost apologetically, and the pre-written statements. That made Halina look at Bruno again with a very tired kind of recognition. Mr. Larkin, who had kept respectfully near the entrance, cleared his throat and held out a small ring of spare locker keys. Miss Cross, he said gently, if you'd like, I can open it for you. She gave him the faintest nod of thanks, but Daniel was already walking toward the employee hall. I'll go with her, he said. Halina followed without protest. Janice moved instinctively as if to come too, then stopped when Theo touched her sleeve and shook his head. Not because Halina should be alone, but because too many bodies in that hall would make it feel like another audience. Mr. Larkin came behind them at a distance with the key ring softly chiming in his hand. The hall smelled of floor cleaner and old coats. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Halina's blue locker looked smaller from close up, almost childish with that red notice slapped across it. Daniel peeled the paper off slowly. The adhesive made a rough tearing sound that seemed louder than it should have. He folded the notice once and slipped it into the canvas bag with the other evidence. Mr. Larkin opened the locker and stepped away. Inside were exactly the kinds of things a life in narrow margins leaves at work. A folded blue sweater, a second pair of shoes wrapped in grocery plastic, a refill card for the bus, a hand cream tube squeezed nearly flat, and one white envelope tucked above the shelf lip so it would not bend. Halina reached for the envelope first. Her thumb brushed the corner as if checking it still existed. Rent, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Daniel looked away to give her the dignity of that small private relief. People speak about losing jobs as if it begins and ends with pride. Often it begins with bus cards, sweaters, rent envelopes, the practical architecture of staying afloat one more week. Then Halina saw something else in the back of the locker. She frowned, reached deeper, and pulled out a paper bag folded twice at the top. Grease had darkened one corner. This wasn't here yesterday, she said. Mr. Larkin looked genuinely confused. No one should have opened that after lock notice. Halina unfolded the bag. Inside were 3 cinnamon rolls from the front case, bruised but still wrapped, and a note in blocky handwriting on receipt paper. For the kids. Sorry I didn't speak up. No name. Halina stood still a second, reading it again. The gesture was almost unbearably small and human. Somebody in that building had watched her be branded a thief, had stayed silent, and then had left contraband sweetness in her locker for the shelter children. Shame and kindness, both arriving late, both real. She tucked the bag carefully into her lunch sack. Whoever it was, she murmured, they were scared. Daniel heard the sentence and felt it strike deeper than it had any right to. Fear had been running the whole place. Fear of managers, fear of mockery, fear of being seen helping the wrong person. That, more than any memo, was the culture he had allowed to grow. When they came back to the front, another employee had arrived, Carl from Waste, now washed up and in a clean overshirt, though the fatigue in his face had not changed. He stood near the table, cap in both hands, as if reporting to a courtroom rather than a bakery before sunrise. Janice looked from him to Halina, and some unspoken current passed between them. Theo had already sent the original video to Claire.
Bruno remained by the register, arms folded too tightly, still trying to wear authority like a coat that no longer fit. Daniel set Halina's removed notice down on the table beside the witness drafts and the still frame from the yard. "We are not doing this in whispers anymore," he said. Before anyone could answer, the side door alarm chirped again. This time, it was not one of the early crew. It was the regional human resources manager, walking in with a leather folder under her arm and Bruno's termination draft already in her hand. The woman from Regional Human Resources paused 2 steps inside the door when she realized she had walked into something very different from the quick signature stop she had expected. Her name was Laura Penn. She was known across the district for neat files, neat shoes, and a manner so measured it could make even innocent people feel they should sit up straighter. This morning, though, her composure slipped for just a blink. In one glance, she took in Halina by the counter, the red locker notice folded on the cafe table, Janice and Theo standing together instead of apart, Carl still in his clean overshirt, Bruno pale with a look he was trying to pass off as control, and Daniel Vale himself standing beside a spread of evidence like a man who had been awake all night for a reason. Laura's leather folder remained tucked under her arm. "Mr. Vale," she said carefully, "I was told this was an urgent personnel matter." Daniel answered with a calm that made the room tighten rather than relax. "It is. Put the folder down." Laura did. She set it on the table and glanced at the cover page visible through the clear sleeve. Halina's name sat there in typed black letters above the words, "Immediate suspension recommendation." Halina saw it too. Her face did not break, but some last private hope in her posture did. Daniel opened the folder before Bruno could claim process again. The first page summarized the accusation in polished language. Unauthorized product removal, reputational exposure, defiance during supervisory intervention. Daniel read only the opening lines before sliding it toward Laura. "Who prepared this?" Laura looked at Bruno first, then back at Daniel. "The draft originated at branch level and was escalated overnight through operations. I was asked to execute review at opening." "Asked by whom?" Daniel said. Laura named 2 district operations managers. Claire had already mentioned them. Daniel nodded once, not surprised. "And did anyone send you the unedited footage?" Laura hesitated. "No." "Did anyone tell you the sacks had already been opened and contained only bread logged for destruction?" "No." Daniel placed one of the still prints on top of the draft. "They do now." Laura lowered her eyes to the image. Her expression changed in the subtle, serious way competent people change when they realize they have been brought into a lie halfway through its construction. Daniel did not grandstand. He simply arranged the evidence in front of her, one piece at a time. Disposal logs, timestamp history, the local password change, pre-written witness statements, the print showing Bruno looking directly at the loaves. Then Theo handed over his phone with the full crowd-angle video already cued. Laura watched in silence. Janice's voice in the clip saying, "They're just old loaves," made her look up sharply. Bruno stepped in at once, trying to catch the room before it finished turning. "Context matters," he said. "This employee has been removing product off-site for years. We are talking about pattern, not optics." Laura straightened, but before she could speak, Halina did. "Yes," Halina said quietly. "For years." The admission landed hard because it was so plain. No trembling denial, no evasive little half-truth, just the truth given cleanly. Daniel turned to her, not alarmed, only attentive. Halina kept her eyes on Laura. "I took the bread after close. I did. The stale loaves, the split rolls, the things marked to be ruined. I took them to Sparrow House every evening I could, because they feed children there and because those children do not care whether a loaf was pretty enough to sell at noon." Bruno almost pounced on the sentence. "There. Thank you. We can stop pretending this is fabricated." But Halina was not finished. "And your night manager before you knew.
and the one before him knew enough not to ask questions that would lead to food being destroyed faster.
I never took cash, never took fresh stock, never changed a code, never hid what could be counted. I carried what your own system had already condemned. Laura listened without interrupting. Daniel did too. There are moments when the truth needs to arrive in the voice of the person who paid for it. Mr. Larkin spoke next, timidly but clearly. If I may, I've seen Miss Cross leave with those sacks many nights over the years. No one ever treated it as theft until last evening. Carl followed, rubbing his thumb against the edge of his cap. And I was told to bleach the bread after the scene so nobody could use it later. Janice lifted one of the witness drafts. These were printed before anyone asked me what happened. Theo added, I kept the full video because the short one online made her look guilty on purpose. One by one, the room stopped orbiting Bruno's version and began orbiting what had actually happened. Laura absorbed it all with the stillness of someone rewriting an entire morning in her head. Daniel reached into the canvas bag and brought out the photocopied policy memo with his own signature. That rule, he said, laying it in front of Laura, made this possible.
Bruno enforced it cruelly. I authored the conditions that let cruelty feel professional. Laura looked from the memo to Daniel in visible surprise. Few owners speak that way in rooms like these. Fewer still do it before dawn with staff as witnesses. Bruno saw the ground slipping and made his last strategic move. Even if Mr. Vale wants to revisit policy, that doesn't erase unauthorized conduct. If we excuse this because it ended sentimentally, every branch loses the line between order and chaos. Daniel's face went still. He placed Etta's letter on top of the memo, though no one else in the room yet knew what it said. No, he answered. What we're about to erase is the line you drew between decency and theft. Laura put a hand on the termination draft, but instead of sliding it toward Halina, she closed the folder. She looked at Daniel and asked, very carefully, Before I void this, what exactly is Sparrow House? Laura kept her hand on the closed folder as she asked it, as if the answer might decide whether that folder stayed a threat or became evidence against the people who had drafted it. For a moment, no one spoke. The bakery's front lights brightened by 1 automatic degree, and the glass cases caught a weak, early sheen. Halina looked at Daniel, not to ask permission, but because she understood that whatever came next would not be small anymore. Sparrow House had survived partly because it had remained quiet. Quiet places can keep feeding children a long time if no one important feels the need to rearrange them. Daniel knew that too. He also knew the question could no longer be pushed aside. Laura was not asking for gossip. She was asking what moral ground this whole room had just stepped onto. It's a children's shelter, Halina said first, her voice low but steady. Old building behind the chapel annex on Mercer Lane. They run beds, supper, breakfast when they can, homework tables in the afternoon, and a clothing shelf nobody admits they need until winter. She did not dress it up. She named it the way people name a place they love enough not to turn into a speech. Laura listened closely. Daniel added, It also happens to be the place that took me in when I was a boy. That changed Laura's face more than the evidence table had. Not because sentiment suddenly mattered more than policy, but because the story that Bruno had sold upward as ordinary theft now had a line running through it all the way to the owner's own childhood. Bruno let out a small sound of frustration. That is unfortunate, sir, but it doesn't change. Daniel turned to him. It changes exactly what kind of blindness built this rule. Laura looked from Daniel to the letter on the table. That's why this matters to you personally. No, he said. It matters personally because I failed to see it. It matters professionally because my company taught people to bleach bread rather than let hungry children eat it. Janice lowered her eyes at that. Mr. Larkin removed his glasses and polished them on the hem of his vest, though they were not dirty. Carl just stared at the floor tiles as if he had been trying not to think that sentence for years. Theo shifted his weight and looked toward Halina with something close to apology still living in his face.
Laura opened the folder again. She slid the draft out, read the summary line once more, and then compared it with the still frame showing the bread in the sacks. This report claims unknown contents and evasive conduct, she said. That language is now unsupportable. Bruno tried to recover one last legal foothold. Policy breach still stands. Laura did not even look at him when she answered. A breach review requires clean facts and clean handling. We have neither. That was the first time someone besides Daniel had publicly stepped out of Bruno's shadow in a way he could not dismiss. He felt it. Everyone did. Then Daniel did something none of them expected. He took Etta's letter, unfolded it, and handed it to Laura. Read the marked line. She scanned until her eyes caught the sentence he had heard in Sparrow House. Ask what policy broke in you. Laura exhaled softly. It named the whole moral failure more clearly than any compliance memo ever could. Who wrote this? She asked. Daniel answered, a woman who used to save my supper with bakery bread before I owned a single thing. Halina watched him say it, and in that moment some part of the distance between them changed. He was still the owner. She was still the worker who had been publicly branded a thief. But now the room could see that he was not speaking from abstraction anymore. Laura set the letter down with care. I'm voiding this draft, she said, placing her palm over Halina's suspension recommendation. Bruno took a step forward. You can't void it unilaterally. Laura looked up at him, and for the first time there was steel in her voice. I can stop a procedurally contaminated action before execution, and I am doing that now. She drew a line across the first page with her pen and wrote, Review halted, pending executive investigation. Date, time, initials. The sound of pen on paper was small, but the effect on the room was not. Halina did not smile. She only closed her eyes for one brief second, as if allowing herself one single breath of relief before whatever came next. But Daniel was not finished. Not pending, he said quietly. Laura looked at him. What do you mean? Daniel's gaze moved across the table, over the footage still, the pre-written statements, the audit trail, the policy memo, the red locker notice, and finally to Bruno. I mean, this does not go back into a file and wait for a committee to discover a conscience next Tuesday. His voice never rose, which made everyone listen harder. At opening, before the full staff begins the day, we address this in the bakery. Publicly, where the accusation was made, where the fear lives. Janice's head lifted at once. Theo looked almost startled. Mr. Larkin's glasses froze halfway back to his face. Even Laura seemed taken aback, because corporate people are taught to pull scandal behind closed doors, smooth it into statements, and let dignity remain unevenly distributed if that keeps operations tidy. Daniel was choosing the opposite. Bruno heard the danger in it immediately. You can't stage some emotional spectacle in front of employees. That's reckless. No, Daniel said. What was reckless was turning humiliation into management technique. He turned to Janice. How long until the rest of the morning crew arrives? 15 minutes for bakers, 20 for counter, maybe sooner for Sylvia from pastries, she answered automatically. Daniel nodded. Good, let them come. Then he looked at Carl. And I want the remaining bread from last night's disposal hold brought up front, all of it that hasn't been ruined. Carl blinked. There are 2 sacks in the waste cage and 1 tray of split sandwich loaves still on the rack. Bruno snapped. Those are not for display. Daniel met his eyes. They are now. That sentence hung in the warm, yeasty air like a struck bell, because everyone in the room understood what he was about to do, and why Bruno was suddenly afraid of a few old loaves more than he had ever been afraid of the truth. Carl disappeared toward the waste cage without another word, and the rest of them remained in that strange front room stillness that comes before something public and irreversible. The bakery was waking up around them now. Ovens clicked hotter. A mixer started in the prep room with a heavy turning groan. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck hissed its brakes at the curb.
Morning employees began to arrive one by one, each stepping through the front or side entrance expecting the ordinary rhythm of proofing, trays, register counts, frosting buckets, and coffee. Instead, they found the owner standing by a cafe table covered with paperwork, the regional HR manager beside him, Bruno stripped of his usual command, Halina still in her coat with her lunch bag at her feet, and a feeling in the air that made everyone lower their voices before they even knew why. Sylvia from pastries came in first, sniffed the tension like smoke, and stopped with her keyring halfway to her apron pocket. Then came Omar from ovens, broad and sleepy-eyed, flour already on his forearm. Then, little by little, more of the shift. Daniel did not begin with a speech. He let them gather. He let them see the red notice folded on the table. He let them notice Theo's phone, Janice's pale face, Mr. Larkin standing straighter than usual, Laura Penn holding a voided termination draft instead of an active one. Most of all, he let them see Bruno waiting and not leading. That alone told them something had broken in the usual order. When enough had arrived that the room felt full but not crowded, Carl came back through the side corridor carrying one of the burlap sacks in both arms. Another worker followed with the second. Behind them, on a cooling tray lined with paper, lay the split sandwich loaves and heel ends from the previous night. Good enough to toast, good enough to soup, good enough to feed somebody if nobody insisted on confusing pride with standards. The smell of old bread drifted up, dry and faintly sweet. A murmur moved through the staff. Everybody knew those sacks. Everybody knew what they usually meant by morning. Daniel stepped beside them and placed one hand on the coarse burlap. "These," he said, finally lifting his voice just enough for the room to carry it, "are what Halina Cross was accused of stealing. No theatrics, no pounding, just the plain statement." He opened the top himself and folded the edge back. The staff saw the loaves. Some had expected that, some had not. Sylvia's mouth parted. Omar rubbed the back of his neck and looked away in shame. Daniel continued. "They were logged for destruction before she touched them. That is documented. They contain no missing store goods, no hidden product, no cash stock, no theft." He picked up the still frame and held it high enough for the nearest employees to see. And this shows the moment that was already clear in the yard. Bruno took a step forward. "Mr. Vale, with respect, staff discipline should not be aired like this." Daniel turned to him with a calm that cut harder than volume. "You aired it first." That stopped him. Daniel looked back at the employees. What happened last night was not discipline. It was humiliation. He set the still down and lifted one of the pre-written witness statements instead. These were prepared before witnesses were properly heard. Then the audit trail. This branch password was changed after the fact. Then the voided draft. And a termination was pushed through before review. Every object on that table did part of the talking for him. This was what evidence looked like when it finally stopped serving the wrong person. Laura stepped in at that point to confirm what could no longer be hidden. "The suspension recommendation for Miss Cross has been halted," she said clearly. "This is now an executive investigation into branch conduct and policy misuse." Staff exchanged glances. A few looked visibly relieved. Others looked frightened in a new direction now that the old map had torn. Janice breathed out hard, almost like someone surfacing. Theo kept his eyes on the floor. Halina stood still with both hands around the strap of her lunch bag, as if she had not yet decided whether the ground beneath her could really be trusted. Then Daniel did the one thing no one expected in a bakery before sunrise. He asked Halina to speak. At first, she looked as if she might refuse. From tiredness, from the exhaustion of being made into a lesson for other people too many times in one night. But then she stepped forward, just one pace, and rested her hand on the open sack. "I took this bread," she said. The room went silent enough to hear the refrigeration units humming behind the cake case. "I took it because it was going to be ruined. I took it because children at Sparrow House have eaten from these sacks for years. I took it because old bread can still become breakfast toast, soup thickener, bread pudding, garlic crumbs, and something warm in small hands. If that shames this building, then the shame is not in the sack. No raised voice, no performance, just truth, spoken by someone too worn out to decorate it. Several workers lowered their heads.
Sylvia wiped at one eye quickly, embarrassed to be seen doing it. And then, from the back of the group, Omar spoke up. "I've loaded extra rye in winter." His voice was rough with nerves. Another worker, Mari from Wraps, added, "I've saved clean paper for her to separate the loaves." Janice said, "I knew more than I admitted." One by one, not loudly, not heroically, the room began to confess its own little acts of silence and help. This mattered more than any corporate memo ever could. Fear was loosening, not gone, loosening. Daniel listened, then reached for the photocopied policy memo bearing his own signature. He held it up in front of the whole staff. "This rule," he said, "ends today." Before the meaning of that could fully settle, the side door opened again, and two district operations managers walked in, summoned too late to stop the truth, but early enough to try. The two district operations managers came in with the brisk, bothered energy of men who had left their beds convinced they were arriving to contain a nuisance. Martin Keene was first through the door. Heavy-set, expensive watch, tie knotted too tight for that hour. His expression already arranged into managerial irritation. Behind him came Ross Dempsey, leaner, sharper around the mouth, carrying a tablet and the air of someone who prefers numbers because numbers do not cry in loading yards. Both slowed when they saw the gathered staff, the sacks on the floor, Laura Penn standing with a voided suspension folder, and Daniel at the center of a room that had clearly moved far beyond normal branch procedure. Martin tried to recover fastest. "Daniel," he said, skipping the formal title in a bid for familiarity. "We got Claire's message. I think everyone needs to take a breath before this becomes a district-wide overreaction." Ross nodded toward the sacks. "We can't set a precedent by emotionalizing shrink." That one word, shrink, hung in the air like something stale. Daniel did not invite either man farther in. "You're late," he said. Martin blinked. Late for what? Daniel looked at the evidence table, then at the staff. Late for the moment when this could have been quietly framed as a misunderstanding. Ross took in the papers more carefully now. "What exactly are we looking at?" Laura answered before Bruno could. "A contaminated disciplinary action, altered local archive settings, pre-written witness statements, and clear evidence that the employee was publicly accused after the contents of the sacks were already known." Martin's brows drew together. Known to be what? Janice, to her own surprise more than anyone else's, answered from beside Theo. "Old bread." Silence followed, short, heavy. Ross exhaled once through his nose like a man already calculating fallout. Bruno tried to step back into usefulness. "What they are not saying is that Miss Cross admitted to taking product off-site for years. We are not debating compassion. We are debating control." Daniel turned to him, then to Martin and Ross. "Listen carefully. Last night, a worker was branded a thief in front of staff and phones. The sacks contained bread that had already been logged for destruction. Your branch manager changed local footage settings after the fact, generated witness forms before witness review, and pushed an overnight termination packet to HR. If your first instinct is still to say the word control, then you are exactly the people I need in this room." Ross stiffened at that. Martin tried another route. "Even if Pike mishandled tone, the broader policy exists for reasons. Liability, inconsistent donations, informal side channels. If every store starts deciding its own moral exceptions," Halina spoke before he could finish, "children aren't a side channel." The sentence was quiet, but it stopped him. Martin looked at her then as if truly seeing her for the first time. Not a report, not a risk item. A woman in a worn coat with a lunch bag by her feet and flour still caught in one cuff, standing beside sacks that smelled faintly of yesterday's loaves. She did not try to impress him. "I took what your system meant to ruin," she said. "I carried it to children who ate it.
If you want to call that exposure, then say it while looking at the bread. Ross shifted his tablet from one hand to the other.
He did not seem moved exactly, but he was no longer standing on abstract ground. Carl, who had been silent for too long in his life, added, "I was told to pour bleach over it." Martin's head snapped around. "You did what?" Carl met his stare. "What Manager Pike told me." Bruno cut in sharply, as a sanitation precaution. Laura said, flat as paper, "No, as a destruction measure after the public scene." That was the moment the district men understood the problem was no longer one woman and two sacks. It was chain policy, branch conduct, HR exposure, reputational damage, and a room full of employees who now had names, faces, timestamps, and a witness trail. Daniel let that realization settle before he picked up the photocopied policy memo one more time. "This rule is over," he said. Martin raised a hand automatically, the reflex of a man used to slowing decisions with process. "You cannot terminate a chain-wide disposal directive off the bakery floor." Daniel's gaze did not move. "I just did." Ross stepped in. "You can suspend it pending executive review." "No," Daniel said. Suspension is what people say when they want a bad thing to survive on technical life support until attention drifts. He set the memo down. "I am ending it. Claire will issue the notice within the hour. Effective immediately. Edible unsold bread is not to be destroyed while a formal redistribution protocol is built. Every branch holds, logs, and reports. No exceptions." The staff in the room looked from Daniel to the sacks as if the objects themselves had changed meaning right there on the tiles. Martin's face hardened. "You're making a charity decision with logistics consequences you have not studied." Daniel almost smiled, but it held no warmth. "Then it's fortunate that the person in this building with the most practical experience moving that bread is standing right there." Every eye turned to Halina. She seemed almost startled by it. Bruno gave a short, incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious." Daniel ignored him. "She knows timing, volume, what keeps overnight, what becomes breakfast, what goes stale too far, which items travel safely, and where they're needed before sunrise. More than that, she knows the difference between giving away leftovers and feeding people with dignity." Halina stared at him, not grateful yet, not trusting enough for that, just stunned. Martin stepped closer to the table. "Before anyone starts inventing a redemption story, we still have a branch manager under review and district managers who need to report upward. We should clear the floor, separate witnesses, and manage communications." Daniel took the voided suspension draft from Laura's hand, tore it cleanly down the middle, then once more across, and laid the pieces on top of the open sack. The room did not breathe for a second. "No," he said. "We are done managing appearances before people." Then he turned to Laura. "Draft the written reversal on Miss Cross now." To Martin and Ross. "Draft Bruno Pike's immediate removal from supervisory authority pending formal misconduct proceedings." To Claire, already on speaker through his phone. "Prepare the chain notice ending the destruction order." Bruno looked as if somebody had struck him without touching him. "You can't remove me like this." Daniel met his eyes. "Watch closely." And just then, Halina reached into her lunch bag, took out the folded paper sack someone had left in her locker, and placed it on the table. When she opened it, the room saw the 3 bruised cinnamon rolls and the little note inside. "For the kids. Sorry I didn't speak up." No name, no signature. Just proof that even in fear, this place had been waiting for permission to become decent again. The little paper sack on the table changed the room in a way no formal statement could have. 3 slightly flattened cinnamon rolls, wrapped in waxed paper and left in secret for children most of the staff had never seen, sat beside the torn suspension draft, the witness forms, the old loaves, and the policy memo. It was such a small offering. That was exactly why it mattered. Martin Keene looked at the note and seemed, for the first time that morning,
embarrassed in a human way instead of a professional one. Ross Dempsey did not soften, not outwardly, but even he stopped speaking in the dry language of district exposure and looked, briefly, like a man who had remembered there were real hands at the other end of a policy.
Bruno saw the note too, and whatever else he felt, he understood at once that the bakery had already begun slipping away from his version of events. Fear thrives in isolation. That scrap of kindness proved isolation had never been complete. Daniel let the silence do some work, then turned to Halina. "Do the children at Sparrow House know you couldn't bring the bread last night?" Halina nodded. "They know there was trouble. Do they have breakfast this morning?" She hesitated. "Miriam had potato bread saved, and maybe some pan loaf from yesterday. They'll manage." Daniel heard the word manage and felt it the way only people who have once lived on the far side of plenty can feel it, as an indictment. Sparrow House had always managed. That was the problem. Places that manage too quietly teach the powerful not to look at them. He turned to Carl. "How much here is still edible?" Carl glanced at the sacks, then at the split loaves on the tray. "Most of it, if you move fast. Dry, but good. Maybe enough for breakfast and later toast if somebody knows how to stretch it." Halina's eyes moved toward the bread instinctively, already calculating. Daniel noticed. "Then we don't discuss feeding people as a future concept," he said. "We do it this morning." Laura lifted her head. "Daniel, if you mean to send product off-site now, I need at least a written chain of custody note until formal policy language exists." Daniel nodded. "You'll have one." Then he looked to Janice. "Find clean produce crates and a marker." To Theo. "Get bakery paper, twine, and anything that can separate sweet from savory." To Carl. "No bleach near any of this." Carl almost looked insulted by the idea after everything that had happened, then realized the order was not about mistrust anymore. It was about naming a new line clearly enough. "Yes, sir," he said. Mr. Larkin, still by the entrance, raised a tentative hand. "My nephew has a hatchback. He uses it for pharmacy deliveries in the afternoons. He's off this morning. If you need transport—" Daniel nodded with gratitude that carried none of the easy condescension rich men sometimes mistake for warmth. "Call him." The bakery shifted around that decision as if a second morning had begun inside the first one. Janice fetched crates. Theo laid out paper. Sylvia brought string from the pastry station without being asked. Omar quietly moved a prep scale aside so the front cafe table could become a packing surface. Even Ross, who would never have volunteered if Daniel had not been watching, stepped closer to inspect how much food was actually being discussed. "This is one branch," he muttered. "How much chain-wide waste are we talking about?" Halina answered before Daniel could. "At this branch alone? On a slow night, enough for one shelter breakfast and maybe an afternoon snack. On a heavy night, 2 sites if someone routes properly." Ross stared at her. "You know that from memory?" "From carrying it," she said. Again, no pride, just fact. Martin looked at Daniel then with a different kind of concern. Not whether this would be emotional, whether it would be big. While the others sorted bread, Daniel stepped aside long enough to call Claire once more. "I want a same-day count from every branch," he said. "Unsold bread by type, destruction volume, donation restrictions, transport capacity, and nearest shelter or community kitchen. No summaries. Raw numbers first." Claire did not ask why now. She could hear the room through the phone, the movement, the low voices, the sound of crates being set down. "I'll build the grid," she said. "And the chain notice?" Daniel looked back at the table where Halina was already separating the sweeter pieces so the cinnamon scent would not soak into the rye. "Draft it," he said, "but don't send it yet. I want one more thing done first." "What?" Claire asked. Daniel watched Halina wrap the anonymous cinnamon rolls separately and label them in neat block letters for the younger kids. "I want the first official delivery made before the email goes out." That was strategy of a very different kind. Let the new rule arrive already alive.
Laura wrote the temporary transfer note at the edge of the table while the staff worked around her. Product description, condition, destination, authorized by executive order pending policy rewrite. She handed Daniel the pen to sign, and he did. Bruno stood apart now, not ignored exactly, but no longer central to the room. This may have been the first true punishment he felt, not the threat of formal review, irrelevance. Martin finally approached him in a low voice and said something no one else caught. Whatever it was, it did not restore him. Bruno only stared at the crates and the bread, as if trying to understand how a morning he had begun by sealing a locker had turned into an operation leaving him behind. Mr. Larkin's phone rang. He answered, listened, nodded twice, and looked up. "My nephew can be here in 8 minutes," Daniel said. "Good." He turned to Halina. "You'll go with the first load." She blinked. "Me?" "You know the place, the people, and what should go first." Halina glanced toward Laura, then toward the district managers, then back at the bread. "And if this becomes another performance?" Daniel shook his head. "Then I'll be in the car behind you." That caught her off guard. So did what he said next. Some things need to be seen with the right eyes before they can be defended properly. She held his gaze for a second longer than she had before. The front bell jingled again. Miriam from Sparrow House had stepped into the bakery, breathless from hurrying, coat thrown over her house dress, and in her hand she carried something wrapped in a kitchen towel that she said Daniel needed to see before anything left this building. Miriam came in with cold air at her back and purpose in every step. The kitchen towel bundle held against her chest as if it were fragile. She had clearly left in a hurry. Her coat was buttoned wrong by one button. One shoe had a dusting of flour across the toe. Her breath still carried the quickness of the walk from Sparrow House. The moment Halina saw her, she moved around the table. "What happened?" Miriam shook her head. "Nothing bad. Not yet. But before any of this bread leaves here under a new promise, he needs to see this in front of all of them." Her eyes went to Daniel, then to the district men, then to Laura, and finally, briefly, sharply, to Bruno. She laid the wrapped bundle on the cafe table beside the sacks and unfolded the towel. Inside was an old enamel plate, white once, now crazed with hairline cracks and chipped blue around the rim. Resting on it was a stack of index cards tied with kitchen string, and on top, a smaller photograph Daniel had never seen. In it, he was maybe 8, seated at a long table in Sparrow House with a bowl in front of him and both hands around a heel of bread, as if heat itself lived in it. Nobody mocked small things anymore in that room. Miriam touched the plate with 2 fingers. "This was your breakfast plate," she said to Daniel. "Etta kept it after you left. Said you always held it close before eating, like somebody might change their mind and take it back." Daniel said nothing at first. He could not. The bakery around him blurred the edges for one suspended second. Not dramatically, not in a way meant for witnesses, just enough that he had to plant one hand on the chair beside him. The plate smelled faintly of old cupboard wood and clean soap, like things preserved by practical women who never called themselves keepers of history. Miriam lifted the stack of index cards next. "These are breakfast counts, not from years ago, from this month." She untied them and spread several across the table. Children's first names in block letters, allergies in pencil. One card marked soft toast only. Another, no cinnamon. Another, save crust for later. "When Halina brings bread," Miriam said, "this is how it becomes morning. Not surplus, not waste diversion. Morning." Ross Dempsey looked down at the cards with an expression that had finally lost its love of abstraction. Martin Keene said nothing at all. Then Miriam took one more item from the towel, a folded paper, newer than the rest. "And this," she said, "is why I came running." She handed it to Laura first. It was that day's breakfast board from Sparrow House, written before dawn in Miriam's blunt hand. "Bread expected," crossed out. Under it, revised in haste, "Thin potato slices, 1 egg each if enough, tea." Laura read it, then passed it to Daniel. The change was small on paper. In real life, it was the distance between steady and scraping through. Halina did not look at the board. She already knew what it meant. Daniel did too. Something in him settled for good right there. Decision with roots. He set the board beside the old policy memo and said very quietly, "Then no child waits another hour because this company took too long to remember what bread is for." That was the moment the room stopped being a hearing and became an operation. Daniel turned to the staff and gave instructions the way some men give orders in crisis, fast, clear, with no wasted ornament. Janice would note each item leaving the branch by type and condition. Theo would print copies of the temporary transfer note and save the digital footage to 2 drives. Carl and Omar would load the crates, careful with the softer loaves. Sylvia would box the cinnamon rolls separately so they wouldn't get crushed. Mr. Larkin would meet his nephew at the curb and guide him to the side entrance. Laura would prepare written notice that Halina's termination draft had been voided and that Bruno Pike was relieved, effective immediately, of any authority over staff or inventory pending executive action. Martin opened his mouth at that. Daniel cut him off without raising his voice. If District wants to contest the wording, District can do it after breakfast reaches the shelter. Bruno had gone very still by then, stillness of a different kind than fear. This was the stillness of a man realizing the machinery he trusted had chosen a new operator. "You're making a mistake that won't stop at one branch," he said. Daniel looked at him and, for the first time that morning, answered with something almost sad. "I know. That's why it starts here." Then he handed Laura the witness drafts, the locker notice, the footage stills, and the password audit. "Keep these with you." Laura took them and nodded once. No hesitation now. At the side entrance, the sound of a small car pulling up reached them through the hum of the proofers. Mr. Larkin's nephew had arrived. Staff began lifting crates. The old loaves that had been treated like a problem an hour ago were now being sorted by use, wrapped by hand, labeled for children who had names. Halina tied the first crate herself and wrote on the top sheet in neat dark marker, "Breakfast, toast, soup bread, sweet rolls separate." Daniel stood beside her when she did it. Their shoulders nearly touched. Neither mentioned it. There are moments when words only make honest things clumsier. Then Claire called again. Daniel answered on speaker because his hands were full helping Carl steady the second crate. Claire's voice came through bright with urgency. "Before you leave, one more development. The edited clip from last night has been picked up by a Morning City Stream account. But Theo's original just uploaded too, and the comments are turning. Fast." The room paused. Even Bruno looked up. Claire kept going. "One local reporter has already messaged asking where Sparrow House is and whether the owner is really involved." Daniel looked at the bread, the plate, the breakfast cards, the people in front of him. Public attention was no longer coming later. It was already on its way. And outside the side door, just as the first crate was lifted toward the waiting car, a second vehicle pulled up behind Mr. Larkin's nephew's hatchback, a news van with its headlights still on. The news van sat at the curb with its headlights washing the bakery wall white, but Daniel did not step toward it. He looked once through the side window, saw the shape of a cameraman climbing out, and made his choice in the same quiet way he had made the others that morning. "No interviews here," he said. "Not now." Then he turned to Miriam. "The food moves first." That decided the order of the world again. Not explanation, not image repair, not statement crafting. Bread first. Breakfast first. Halina lifted the first crate with Carl and slid it into Mr. Larkin's nephew's hatchback beside the second one. Theo tucked the copied transfer note under the twine. Janice set the separate little parcel of cinnamon rolls on top, where it would not be crushed. Laura signed the temporary release. Ross and Martin stood back and watched a system they would never have designed begin working without waiting for their comfort. Bruno tried once to speak over it, but Daniel did not even turn. "You're finished giving instructions in this building," he said.
That was all. Halina climbed into the front passenger seat with the breakfast list, the marked transfer sheet, and the old enamel plate wrapped back in Miriam's towel. Daniel got into his own car behind them because some promises should be walked all the way to the door. The two cars pulled out together just as the city reporter reached the sidewalk. She called once after them. Daniel kept driving. Behind them, through the bakery glass, staff who had spent years lowering their eyes stood in full daylight around the open sacks and watched the old rule leave the building in crates. Sparrow House was awake when they arrived. The gate stood open. Children in socks and oversized sweaters were already near the kitchen door, because word travels faster than cars in places where everyone has learned to listen for help. The smell of boiling potatoes met them in the yard, thin and brave. Then the first crate came through the gate, and the whole place changed sound. Relief has its own voice, a rustle of movement, a hand over a mouth, a child asking, "Is that ours?" Miriam answered, "Yes, baby, this morning, yes." Halina carried in the parcel of cinnamon rolls herself and set them on the side table with the younger children's names. Daniel followed with the second crate and stopped just inside the kitchen because the room had narrowed around him in a way it had not done in decades. The same chipped counters, the same steam on the window, different children, same hunger, same women finding a way. One little boy, no more than 6, peered into the crate and touched a loaf as if checking whether it was truly real. "Warm enough," he said to nobody in particular and smiled. That smile reached Daniel more directly than the policy memos, the footage, the managers, the scandal, all of it. Halina had already taken off her coat and was sorting at the table beside Miriam, moving with that old practical grace of hers. Soft bread here, soup bread there, sweet rolls aside, crusts saved. She looked like what she had always been, competent, steady, necessary. Daniel stood watching long enough to understand how close the world had come to removing someone like her from the exact place where she was most useful. By late morning, the chain notice went out to every branch. The destruction order was terminated, effective immediately. Bruno Pike was removed from supervisory authority pending formal misconduct proceedings. All unsold edible bread was to be held, logged, and routed under emergency interim donation rules until a permanent structure could be established. And under that notice, before legal language and routing codes and regional signatures, Daniel added one plain sentence of his own. No employee of this company will again be punished for refusing to confuse waste with integrity. It traveled fast, faster than the ugly clip had the night before, faster even than district gossip. By afternoon, other branches were calling in counts. By evening, Claire had a map open across a conference table, pins marking shelters, community kitchens, and overnight homes. Martin and Ross, now much quieter men, were helping build the transport grid they would once have argued against. Laura Penn rewrote the reporting protocol from the ground up. Mr. Larkin's nephew made 2 more trips before noon and said yes, before anyone asked when Daniel offered him paid delivery work for the new route trial. And Halina did not celebrate the way people expected. When Daniel found her that evening back at Sparrow House, she was at the long kitchen table with a pencil behind one ear and a stack of ruled paper in front of her, making columns. Branch, bread type, hold time, child-safe items, soft food priority, sites with ovens, sites without. Miriam saw Daniel looking and said with quiet satisfaction, "You wanted to know who should build the new system. There she is." Daniel came to the table and set down the official letter appointing her to lead the chain's first citywide surplus bread program. A working role, with pay, authority, transport support, and a direct line above district obstruction. Halina read it once, then again. "You're sure?" she asked. Daniel looked around the kitchen, to the crates emptied into breakfast, to the enamel plate now washed and drying by the sink, to the penciled names on the cards, to the doorway where a child was licking cinnamon sugar from his thumb, and nodded. "I've almost never been more sure of anything." That night, after the children were fed and the kitchen had quieted,
Daniel remained alone in the yard for a minute before getting back in his car. On the sill just outside the back door sat one crust end, forgotten by somebody small and careless in the best possible way. A sparrow hopped down from the fence, tilted its head, and pecked at it once, then again, taking what had been left within reach. Daniel watched it until it flew off into the dusk with a crumb in its beak. Inside, Halina's pencil kept moving across the page, turning what had once been a hidden errand into a route that would have names, times, drivers, and no need for shame. The old bakery sacks lay folded clean by the wall, waiting for morning.